One now. Okay. Well, welcome. It's just us right now. So, if you have questions, don't forget for the midterm or any of the practice exams from here forward, bring them up. I like to spend the first part of class, as you well know, reviewing what we've been doing, and that would include going over any sort of questions that might be confusing. Because sometimes the answer choices aren't apparent, right? It's like, it seems like this might be wrong, but like I told you, I've found eventually I realized that I'm maybe missing one little aspect in my first read through of the problem. The most recent person that I had who passed the PSI, I think I told you, I asked him, he did everything first time through, passed the class first time, passed the PSI first time. And he said, practice tests, practice, practice, practice. He went through the ones we gave him a whole bunch, and he actually did the learn, test, pass a whole bunch. And that was and showing up to class and listening and asking questions. He did all of those things, and it went well for him. So take that for what it's worth, straight from the horse's mouth of a recent successful student. We are in the middle, we're finishing up actually, closing procedures and closing math. And that is a bit of a shock to the system for some people, but it doesn't have to stay that way. I struggled with math historically, but then fast forward, my little brother's 13 years younger than me, and when he had to go through it, I was somehow, I don't know if I developed a couple more wrinkles in the brain since when I went through it, but when he had to go through it and he was struggling, I figured out how to learn it and teach it. And I think it was because I was more determined to help him than I was to help myself. I don't know if that's some weird thing about me, but I learned that people learn differently. That's what the big thing was. He also struggled with chemistry, and that messed me up too, both in high school and college. I only did one, the very first one in college, but a couple of times over, because I just didn't buckle down and study and figure out what works best for me. But fast forward, when I helped him, he was around the D grade level when I realized that he was in trouble with it. And we studied every night together, and it was sort of like a redemption for me. I was able to somehow read the chapter and teach it to him in one evening, and we just kept doing that. And he got to like an A- by the end of the semester. But I learned that, in a class, you kind of have to go at the speed of the average. You can't go at the speed of the slowest student, right? There's always going to be a fastest student who's kind of bored and a slowest student who's kind of struggling, and then the middle group. And that's just sort of how this testing type of class work goes. So you have to figure out how you learn best and spend a lot of time doing your own self-study. So I learned all that fun stuff and realized that sometimes, especially for math, just going through the repetitions, it's like the gym. It really is a lot like working out. And I did that once upon a time, not so much lately, but even just a little bit every day adds up, right? You just knock out even 15 or 20 minutes a day. But I'm the world's worst when it comes to learning a new thing, guitar, music, working out, eating right. I'll think to myself, well, if I can't put an hour into it today, I just won't do anything. What's the use? I find myself falling back into that rut. But it's a lie. It's just not true. A little bit helps because the brain is working on it. The subconscious is working on it in the interim, meantime, from one day to the next. So put in that time, even if some days you can only give it 5 or 10 or 15. But if at all possible, give it an hour or two per day. Because it's just a lot. It's a lot to dig out of a hole. The deeper that hole is, it's near impossible. At this point, you guys have probably figured out what works best for you, what time of day, how you can work around your family obligations and still put in the time needed. So just keep it up, keep going, stay strong. And then, I've had a couple students before who maybe fell into a hole, and come time for the final, they just didn't even show up. One or two. Last time, one of them, she didn't even log in to take the final. And I'm like, why, even if you don't think you will pass, like you're 100% sure you're just not going to pass, at least you have another repetition of going through the ultimate, not even a practice exam, the real exam. Because, by the way, you need a 75% to pass the class exam. But if you make a 60, I believe it's a 69 to 74, then you can just retake the exam without having to go back through the class. So you get one chance at retaking the exam if you score close enough. But then if you make a 68 or less, you do have to retake the class. So, I mean, even if you're 100% convinced you're not going to pass it, this is the ceiling in this business is so high. There's almost no ceiling, right? It's such a, even if it took you double the cost in tries and time and effort to finally get the license, and this is your first time through, and it's going to still take you 2 or 3 or 4 times through, and you're in it for as long as you can afford that right along the way. If you're in it for a couple of $1,000, you're making that back easy with the first sale, whenever that might be. And I'm not going to say you're going to get that first sale in the first month, but just keep it in perspective, right? It's definitely worth it, even if you don't make it the first time. I'm not saying you won't. I'm just saying don't let that derail you. I heard an example in another industry from a family friend the other day, and their dad went through chiropractic school in another state, got the license in the other state, moved here, took the North Carolina exam and failed it, and was so devastated from failing it, he never even tried again, and he just let it go. But that's another one where if you can stick it out and pull through, I mean, that's going to repay itself too. That's another high income career once things kind of start clicking. So don't give up on yourself no matter what. Just stick it out and make the most of every opportunity. Take the practice exam, take the real exam, and then just get back in it. It's pretty cheap to retry too for the, in the big picture. There's my pep talk. I didn't plan on that, but there it just fell out. So let's do our little bit of closing review calculations. Then we'll get into property valuation. That's what's next on the itinerary. Oh, good. Already. And just as a reminder, it's just like these calculations for closing math. It's just like your checkbook. Money's coming in, that's called a credit. Money's going out, that's called a debit. So we're just coming up with the number that the buyer's going to get from the closing. Or, I'm sorry, the number that the buyer's going to need to bring. How much money does the buyer need to bring? And then also how much money will the seller be getting? Sorry. There we go. That's what I wanted. And then we talked about prorations. Not everything is one. In fact, the property tax calculations are 3 potential ways that you're going to need to do it. 2 of those 3 are prorations. One of them is not. One of them is a double debit. Each side gets debited their respective amounts. So we'll recap those here in a little bit. And the proration is a same amount of money coming from one side going to the other side. And it's based on how long they owned the property, how long the seller owned it, therefore how long will the buyer be the owner. We talked about the typical buyer fees. Loan-related things are what the buyer has to pay because the lender says, well, you want to borrow the money, therefore you get to pay all these fees. And part of that is interim interest. That's one of the oddball kind of fees because what's different? What's special about interim interest? Tell me in the chat or speak out if you want. We don't have as many people at the moment. We could definitely be okay if you want to unmute and speak up. What do I mean by interim interest? Then India, go ahead and ask your question whenever you're ready. No? You still have a question? India? Oh, that's okay. No big deal. Go for it. Sure. Oh, well, it was due in part to that experience with my brother teaching him the chemistry. I realized that I really enjoy the teaching side of things. I always kind of have that has sort of always landed in my lap. I guess, accidentally volunteered every firm I was at. Somebody would have a question about a computer thing or a real estate thing, and I would volunteer to answer, or they'd eventually come to me. And so it was just sort of an itch that I always was trying to scratch. And then I thought, well, gosh, here's this real estate education thing that I could also do, because in brokerage, it's all one-on-one, right? Or one-on-two. You and the owners, or you and the other agents, and that's a whole different dynamic. I also thought, well, gosh, there's a big need for coaching and helping agents figure out how to do the business properly. And so I also got into the business to be an official educator, registered with the Real Estate Commission, and learn all the material really well so that I could take it, sort of do an offshoot business, which I'm in the middle of starting to do right now this year, make like a cram course to help people who don't make it through the first time and are trying to get ready for the PSI. So I want to create some sort of product to sell like that, and then also help maybe somebody in their first year, maybe a course for that, and various courses. Something to have content on the shelves while I'm sleeping. Somebody could find it and buy it, right? Sort of like selling books or selling any kind of courses. So it kind of all goes hand in hand with that. And so it's been 5 years that I've been teaching these real estate commission classes and doing brokerage as the main gig. And now I'm getting to the point where I'm like, yeah, okay, it's about time to start making some courses like I originally planned to do. So I don't know if that was what you expected or if that's the right answer, but oh yeah. The grass is always greener, right? It's just, I think I also am I don't know if this is typical for all teachers, but I just have a creative, kind of a lean to myself. I like thinking of new things, ways to get something into somebody's brain, and marketing stuff, just any sort of creativity stuff. And it kind of satisfies that too. And so in real estate brokerage, while it is rewarding financially, you get to a point where it's like, yep, here we are again. I know what to do. Help this buyer find this house, write this offer, negotiate. And frankly, it can get boring after a while. I mean, it's been 26 years, guys. So it's going to be a while before it gets boring, I guess. So one thing you could do is get into a whole nother thing, like go into commercial instead of residential, or property management, or a different price point. But for me, it was like, well, let me do this teaching thing too. And because I can tack it on. I can sort of do it when I'm not doing the other stuff. And then I was a survivor of 2008. And then I learned back then, let's not only do one thing in this business. Let's not have only one source of income. I need to have multiple streams. So it goes like hand in hand with that too. And since that's something you gravitate toward, it might be something once you do something different for a while, maybe because you're strong in that, you come back and incorporate that into it too. Even making content, that's useful. I preach that, although it's not in the curriculum at all. But to actually find customers, it's nice to put content out there, and it's so easy and cheap next to free to do so with all the social media, making videos, even TikToks, but certainly YouTube and Facebook stuff. YouTube is more evergreen. That sticks around easier. Everything else falls off a timeline eventually, but it all works well. And so as a trainer with those tendencies for you, that's going to come naturally too. And I recommend it for everybody, even those who cringe at the thought of seeing and hearing themselves on camera. The first thing I say about that is, well, we're all used to that. You're not. You're the only one who's not. So lovingly get over it and just make the content, right? So I gave you more, I think, than your money's worth there. You probably didn't want all that info, but good for you. That's a good thing. So, okay, back to this interim interest idea. Yeah, thank you. Owed by the borrower, money in the meantime, the remaining days of the month of closing. That's what this interim interest accounts for. Because again, let's take a look here. It's like, I like to do a 3-month window. And here's our month of closing. And we're closing like right here, let's say the 20th of March. Well, when that new buyer makes their first real mortgage payment, their first full mortgage payment, it's not going to be due until May 1st. And when they pay that May 1st payment, it's covering for them having lived there in April. So that still leaves this little bundle of days here, which includes, again, for interim interest, includes the day of closing, because it's a buyer only, right? The buyer's the one who pays it. It's a buyer debit. And so we need to take that day of closing plus the remaining days in the month. And for you in pre-licensing, all months have 30 days. So I just find it this way. 30 minus 20 is 10. But then that does not include the day of closing. We need to add that day in. So it's 11 days, which includes day of closing that the buyer has to pay for. They have to pay daily interest. So the other part of this problem is, how much is the interest per day? And so you find that by knowing the loan amount and the interest rate, and using that to calculate the annual interest, which looks like this. Rate and loan amount. We get that annual interest, divide it by 360 to get the daily, and then multiply those things together. And there's our buyer debit. So the key element here to interim interest, it gets people all the time. They forget the day of closing. They just do. So watch out for it. Interim interest. Anytime you see that, it's an interim interest problem. Okay, don't forget, day of closing goes to buyer. Buyer pays everything. There's not a proration. We're not taking anything or giving anything to the seller. It's nothing but a buyer expense. I think another thing that freaks people out about interim interest is they're like, oh my gosh, how do I get daily interest again? And they just kind of forget about that loan amount and interest rate thing. So again, it could be that they give you the sale price is $363,000, and that the loan to value ratio is, wow, the writing is struggling today, is 80%. And the interest rate on the mortgage is 6.75, which is a pretty close one to the actual rate today, percent. And do we have enough here to figure out what the daily interest is? Sure we do. If you're a collector of T formulas or circle formulas, it's just what we saw. Annual interest goes on top. The rate goes on the bottom. And the loan amount goes on the bottom too. Let's take a minute, because I introduced this circle formula concept way a while back, some of the early math we did. But let's reanalyze this thing and just kind of recognize something, because I want you to be able to, in a moment of maybe confusion on the test, and you can't maybe quite remember the formula itself, what goes where, can't quite remember it, just think about this. The rate goes on the bottom always. And then the rate is something that's being multiplied by a bigger number, right? Bigger than this one. This is going to be a smaller number because we're taking a portion of this thing in order to get that thing. And I know that might sound silly, but sometimes you have to re-educate yourself in the middle of class and to help you remember where things go. In my mind, when I'm panicked or confused or stressed, sometimes things flip around. So that might help you. And then loan to value ratio. I've seen practice test questions that said, how do you get the loan to value ratio? Or how do you get the loan amount? What's the proper math procedure or calculation to determine LTV? What are you dividing? Loan divided by value or value divided by loan? And it's exactly in the order of how it says, loan to value. So if it says the LTV is 80%, then it's going to be the smaller number on top and the larger number, the sale price, on the bottom, because you're borrowing a fraction of the sale price, a piece of it, right? And so let's just make sure that works. First of all, let's see what 80% of 363 is. Oh, look, it's 290. 290,400 divided by 363. And if we do that, 290,400 divided by 363, pretty much the reverse of what we just did. There's the 80%. Oh, it's a decimal. How do we turn a decimal into a percent? Well, now we need to go back the other way to the right. And since it's both changing something to a percent is multiplying it by 100. So if we just say 0.8 times 100, it moves that decimal over 2 places to here. And there's 80%. I think it kind of helps to refresh the math sometimes now that you have the perspective of all these problems. So with that said, we've got, oh shoot, what was it? 290, 400. Okay. So that's 290, 400 times the interest rate of 6.75%. Gives us annually the interest that has to be paid of $19,602. And notice something here, even though interest has nothing to do with taxes, the relationship is similar, right? When you're doing annual taxes, that's another little lesson in just kind of remembering these things. The tax rate goes down here on the bottom. The tax value goes on the bottom because this is a bigger number than this is, right? You're looking for what is the annual tax bill going to look like? It's probably going to be 4 figures, right? 4 or 5 figures. And the tax value is going to be 6 or 7 figures. So just kind of think of it and relate it that way. That might help you remember both of these to kind of, maybe in the moment of panic, you just remember this and you need to know this, but you're like, okay, well, annual taxes goes in the same place that annual interest does. And the rate always goes on the bottom, and then the bigger number than the annual number goes on the bottom too. So I hope that helps. We also talked about, we already knew about origination fee and discount points. I don't think you have any trouble with that. The only thing to be watching out for, if it's origination fee or discount points or annual interest, all of these things are going to require the loan amount. If you need to get the LTV, you're going to need the loan amount to get it. Most of the time, they're going to give you the LTV. They're going to say sale price of $400,000 at an LTV of 90%. But they might say, instead of that, they might say the loan amount is $380,000. What's the LTV? And it's just the reverse, right? You know that this 380 is a percentage of this 400. So the little one goes on top, 380 divided by 400. And there's our 0.95 decimal. To turn that into a percent, multiply it by 100. And that means the LTV of 380 compared to 400 for a sale price is 95%. Loan amount is 95% of the sale price. And if the loan amount is 95% of the sale price, that means the down payment is 5% that the buyer needs to bring. Good? Does that help? Kind of look at it again, analyze how all these pieces work together. So, loan amount is needed for all of these calculations. Origination fee, discount points, annual interest, loan to value ratio, interim interest. I think that's about it that we do. So it's probably useful in your reviewing to make little charts and pages like this. Just say, okay, what kind of calculations, I'd write these out instead of abbreviating them, but what kind of calculations do I need to know the loan amount in order to get? And then you could also say, you need the loan amount there. You could also say, what kind of calculations do I need the price for? Which ones are needed for the sales price? I need the sales price in order to calculate excise tax, loan amount, right? What else? You tell me. What other sorts of calculations that we've learned do you need to use the sale price to get them? There's at least one more that I can think of. Two. Now I've thought of two. What do you need to use the sale price to get? How about, well, you would need it to get tax value, because we've seen how they do. Well, no, they usually give you a sale price. Well, yeah, you would need the sale price in order to calculate tax value, because they would say, here's the sale price. The tax value is 90% of it, right? And then the big one, the one that matters the most, commission. Why are you doing this? Just for fun, just because I love people. It's okay to do it to earn money. You can love the people and also want to make the money too. Okay. And then seller related things. Well, speaking of commission, seller pays the commission. What else does seller pay? There's only a handful compared to what a buyer pays at closing day. What's a seller pay? Don't be shy. Give me something. I'll change the chat so it just comes to me. There. Excise tax, you got it. Excise tax, commission. We learned of one in particular that that the seller pays. They both pay some kinds of closing costs, but seller's closing costs include excise tax, a fee to the attorney for what? What is the attorney doing for the seller? There's one thing in particular the attorney needs to do for the seller. It's like washing your car before you sell it. Preparing the preparing the deed. Yep, deed prep. Seller pays for deed preparation. The seller pays excise tax. Seller pays commission. The seller might pay some recording fees. Seller will pay an overnight fee to send off their final payoff to the lender. So overnight their payoff. The buyer pays a lot more line items, and that includes, of course, the sale price, but also we're talking about closing costs, but anything loan related, like origination fee and discount points, and recording the deed. The deed and the deed of trust. They want both of those things recorded. The lender's going to require them to be recorded. Inspections. What else did we see on that list? Don't forget that list. We saw quite a few things on this thing. There we go. All of this stuff. This could be something like you would see on the test. What is the buyer going to have to bring to closing, or what is the seller going to get from closing? I'll give you one of these for homework and have you do that and bring it in next week, and then we'll go over it. But this is just a conglomeration of all of those little mini calculations put together. And so you're going to have to do them all in order to do the big one and find out what total does the buyer need to bring, or what is the seller going to get out of this. If we go down through this list, let's identify, if we needed to calculate from this, what is the seller going to get at closing? What's the seller going to get? From this list, what do we need? Which parts pertain to the seller? Well, seller gets the sale price, right? They're receiving that in exchange for the property. We're going to have to calculate property taxes. We're going to have to prorate them maybe. So we're going to have to use those to calculate what the seller's getting. What about earnest money deposit? Does this affect the seller's bottom line at all at closing day? Do we need to use the earnest money deposit in our calculation of how much the seller is going to get from closing? Where does it go? When that offer is made, that buyer writes the check for the earnest money. Who's holding it? Do they write that check out to the seller, or do they write it out to someone else? Tell me in the chat. There's one thing that's written. There's two checks that are written with their offer. When you make an offer, two checks are written. One of them is for earnest money and another is for due diligence fee. One of them is non-refundable. Which one is non-refundable? The non-refundable one is the due diligence fee. That due diligence fee doesn't come back to the buyer. Almost never. It would only come back to the buyer if the seller breached the contract, refused to sell it. So due diligence deposit is the one that the buyer makes out the check directly to the seller. Is it Josu? How's the proper way to pronounce your name? I should have asked you this before. Say again. Josue. Thank you. I should have been. Why didn't I ask you that already? Thank you, Josue. Yeah, the earnest money is the refundable one. That's the refundable one. And that's the one that does not go to the seller. It sits, like Josue says, in the possession of either one of the firms or the closing attorney, somebody's trust account. That's where that lives. And so if earnest money doesn't even go to the seller yet, we don't need to do anything with it regarding the seller. Seller doesn't get any. They don't get it, and they don't have to give it because they never had it. So for purposes of calculating how much is the seller going to get at closing, earnest money is irrelevant. It only matters for the buyer's side. We're going to count earnest money as either what? A debit or a credit to the buyer. How do we count earnest money for the buyer? Is it a debit to them or a credit to them? Earnest money, is that going to be given to the buyer at closing as a credit or as a debit? Yeah, that's a credit. It's a credit to the buyer because they had to write the check. And so it counts as a credit to their side. It's that much less money they need to bring with them to the closing. And the same for due diligence money. Except due diligence is different because it is still a credit for the buyer, but it's also a debit for the seller. Due diligence money is a debit for the seller. Why is that? Well, because they already gave it to them. If we don't remember, the closing disclosure we're dealing with here is just a list of all the credits and debits from both sides, doing the math, figuring out what the buyer needs to bring to closing and what the seller's going to get. Therefore, the buyer already gave this due diligence money to the seller. If we don't put it on the closing statement as a debit to the seller while it's been still a credit to the buyer, then we will be giving it to the seller twice. They essentially need to give it back on paper. They're giving it back to the buyer on paper, not physically, but that'll be that much less they get in their proceeds check because they already got it. That'll be that much less they get at closing day because they got it 30 or 40 days ago, back when the offer was accepted. So due diligence deposit is going to count on both sides. It's going to be a credit to the buyer and a debit to the seller. Earnest money is only going to count on the buyer's side as a buyer credit. No debit or credit to the seller. The seller's loan payoff, in this case for $123,000, that's paying off the existing loan that the seller has. They've probably been living there 10 or 15 years, and what's left for their loan to get paid off? $123,000. So that'll show up as a seller debit because they still need to pay it. So let's see if this will work. What I'm doing here is just clearly not good at talking and thinking at the same time. There we go. There we are. So it could look like this. Hopefully we can read this. Let's go down through the list and let's make a chart. So when you're doing that big problem, what's the seller going to get from the closing? Then again, oftentimes they like to give you the same set of facts and figures. They'll give you just this one batch of all of these things, and you'll use that for both of those different questions. Two different questions. One is, how much is the buyer going to need to bring to closing? The other is, how much is the seller going to get at closing? So I just make a chart for both. The buyer's side, all debits and all credits. And the seller's side, all debits, all credits. And then I just go down the list. There we go. And I'll start with sale price. How does the sale price count on the buyer's side? Well, they have to bring it. They have to pay it, $193,750. It's not a credit at all, except for the seller, because that is what the seller is getting. But to the buyer, it's a debit. Are we good so far? Oops. There we go. Sale price. And then I'll just keep on going down the list. There's property taxes. So I'll calculate those and do a little, I'll do a calculation for that. And let's see, what's the property tax situation on this one? We've got $1,843 is what they are for the whole year. We have a closing on November 17th. So if we know that it's closing on November 17th, that's after September 1st. What's the next question in our minds that we're going to need to know when calculating taxes? And the closing is after September 1st. Your next question is what? Tell me. There you go. Have they been paid? And it looks like they have not been paid yet. So let's say not paid. And so if we just look at our timeline for the year, here's our September, here's our November 17th. They've not been paid at all. So we're going to need to take this amount of money for the year from the seller, make that a seller expense. It'll go right here. And we're going to take this amount of money and debit that to the buyer. And that'll go here. A debit to both of them. Since it's not yet been paid, but it can be paid because we're closing after the due date, or after the date that you can start paying. The law, the procedure says then both sides need to pay their piece. So the attorney will collect both of these, add them together, and send it off to the government. Pay the bill. So when that closing is done, that buyer doesn't need to worry about taxes anymore. They're paid for the year. So what do we do here? 1843. Step 1, get the daily. Calculate daily taxes. What's daily taxes on this? If they're $1,843 for the year, how much are they per day? There you go. I might round, call it 512. Because I got 5.119, so I'll call it 512 per day. Step 2, calculate the seller's days. Always do that first, just because you're less likely to lose track of the day of closing. So to calculate the seller's days, if we're closing on November 17th, acknowledge that November is the 11th month, which means there's 10 months that already happened at 30 days each. So that's 300 days right there, plus the 17 days in November for a total of 317 days to the seller. And we can go ahead and do that multiplication. $5.12 times times 317 days. So it's $1,623.04 to the seller. So we'd put that up here, $1,623.04. And then, you know what? You don't even need to calculate the buyer's days at this point. This point, you could just say, well, the total taxes for the year are 1843. And so 1623.04 is what the seller had to pay. Therefore, what's left is what the buyer has to pay. To 1996. 2304. So let me get rid of that. Make it easier to see. Oops. And that's tax. It's a debit to both. There we go. And then I just work my way on down the list. What's next? Earnest money deposit. Well, we know that already. Earnest money, EMD, counts as a credit to the buyer's side, $2,100. Doesn't count as anything for the seller because the seller never got it. They're not getting it. It's just a credit to the buyer. The due diligence money, however, was already given to the seller. So that's going to be something the seller has to be debited for, $3,500. And it's going to be a credit to the buyer's side, that much less that they need to bring. Seller's loan payoff, $123, another debit. Homeowner insurance policy for 1 year. Homeowner's insurance. How much, who pays that? Policy for 1 year, the homeowner premium of $637 due at closing. Who pays that? Got it. $637, yet another buyer debit. Sometimes I'll draw a line to help me stay on track there. And then brokerage commission, 5% of the sale price. Sale price is $193,750. So $96,87.5. Paid by seller. There's my calculation there. Oops. Oh boy. All right. And then we've got homeowner. We did that. Financing. We got a handful of things here. So we know that the loan amount is 90% LTV. So let's calculate that. What's 90% of $193,750? That gives us $174,375. So one thing we can do is put that loan amount in the right place. Where do we need to put the amount being borrowed? Is that a buyer credit or debit? The buyer credit. That lender is essentially giving it to the buyer to benefit them. And then the buyer, they don't get it themselves. They immediately goes straight to the seller as part of what goes to the seller. But the buyer has to now pay that every month. So what is that? That was $174,375. So that's the loan amount on the buyer credit column right there. And then what else do we learn? Now that we know the loan amount, it also says that the loan origination fee is 1.5%. So we can just use that loan amount times 1.5%. So that's another buyer debit. I'm just going to leave it at dollars, $26.15 for space purposes. And then we also know that the discount points, there are 3 of them. What do we do with those? How do we calculate the dollar amount? How much are 3 discount points going to cost? Yeah, there you go. Thank you. 3% of the loan amount. Trying to make room so I can show the calculator on top of all this too. Okay, maybe that'll work. So that gives me 174,375 is the loan amount times 3%. So that's another 52.31.25 for discount points. Buyer debit. And then there we go. Next one is things paid outside of closing, an appraisal report for $350 and a credit report for $60, but we don't have to do that here. We don't need to take any away or give any credit for it. It's just, it was already handled. So it's not a proration. We don't give it as a credit to the borrower. We just acknowledge it. It'll be acknowledged on the on the closing disclosure as POC, paid outside closing. But for this kind of a thing where we're just calculating what buyer's bringing and seller getting, we don't need to put it here at all. We can ignore it for this. Interim interest, though, we do need to deal with that. So the interim interest on the buyer's new loan, we've got a loan amount. So let's get our daily. Multiply that by the interest rate they're borrowing. What's the interest rate that they're borrowing their money on? Oh, you may not be able to see it. It might be kind of small. Let me see if I can zoom it in a little bit. The interest rate they're getting there for a 30-year mortgage on is what? Find it? It's in this section up here. There we go. Thank you, Josue. 7%. So we're going to put that 7% right here. And when we do that math, 174,375 times 7%. That tells us their annual interest paid for the year is 12,206.25. And if we can get the annual, we can turn that into daily. Bring that over here, divide it by 360. So it's $33 a day. $33.91 per day. And now what are we talking about? Interim interest. Therefore, it's just month of closing that we care about. And if we look back at the problem, closing is November 17th. So it's right about here, just over halfway point. So we're going to take 30 days minus 17 days is 13 days. Is that right? And then add in a day for the day of closing. So 14 total days. $14 days times the $33.91 a day. Means a seller debit of $474.74. All right. Now, have you noticed we've been taking a while? This takes a little bit. We're doing a million calculations to get to this one answer. So this should be the last thing you do, right? Don't let this, and it probably is going to show up toward the end of the test, but especially if you struggle with math, if you're a competitive spirited person and you're like, I will conquer this, don't end up taking 30 minutes on this thing if you still haven't done like 10 or 20 other questions yet. Skip it and come back to it, right? They're all worth the same amount. Every single question counts the same. What's the definition of real estate? Counts the same as this thing. So don't waste a bunch of time on it. If you don't get to answer it, this is probably a good one to not get to answer compared to 5 other ones that you know real quick or reasonably faster. In the same amount of time you could be spending on this thing, you could probably answer 5 or 10 questions, right? So keep that in mind, test-taking strategy. The private mortgage insurance premium. Oh, let's put this one in the right place, then we'll take our break. Where does this private mortgage insurance premium need to be? It says it's for the first year and it's due at closing. Therefore, we need to put this where? I'm going to do this so I can go back and forth. We're going to put that 713 under the buyer debit column. PMI. We'll pick it back up in a little bit. I'll see you in 10.
Just wanted to
but always
and
teaching me so much.
and
together. Let's see what we're working with. Dawn, what do you mean? This exercise we're doing right now? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, I'll send it to you. And I'll give you one to do on your own, different numbers. I'm going to change the chat back to so everybody can see what you guys say. Okay. We left off with private mortgage insurance. Next, loan escrow account deposits required by the lender. So it says a couple of things here. It says that the lender is giving instructions that they want the closing attorney to collect 4 months of property taxes. So how do we calculate 4 months of property taxes? Well, what are they? What's the annual property taxes? We learned that annually, the taxes for the year, there we are, 1843. For the whole year, they're 1843. So let's do this. Calculating escrows. We need 4 months of taxes. So we'll take our 1843. There we go. 1843 divided by what? What do we need to get? We need to turn this annual taxes into what? Daily or monthly? Which one? We need to work with what taxes, per day or per month? If we're working on escrows, yeah, we need monthly. So what are we going to divide 1843 by? Divide that by 12. Thank you, Yosway. That means 153.58 per month. Times 4 months, because that's what the lender requires. Means we're going to need to debit the buyer $614.32 for tax escrow. And then we need to do the insurance escrow. And so the lender's instructions to the attorney for that is that we need to collect 3 months of homeowners insurance premiums, 3 months worth. 3 months. And so how much are the homeowners insurance premium? How much is it? Looking back up through here, there it is. $637 for the year. So we need to come up with what that $637 for the year means per month. So we'll divide it by 12. And that is a $53.08 per month charge. But how many months is required? They said 3. So that times 3. Or $159.24. For insurance escrow. And then they also say that the lender wants the attorney to collect 2 months for private mortgage insurance. But this one's a little different. we're not going to take the annual private mortgage insurance and divide by 12 on this one if they give you these instructions. The instructions are, they just wanted, the renewal cost per month is $43.32. So that's all we need to do. 2 months at $43.32 per month. So that's $86.64 for PMI escrow. So notice on this sheet, I've got PMI. I'm handling it in two different places. I'm handling it here because the lender wanted to collect a whole year's worth. And then we're also handling it here because the lender wants to collect 2 months worth to set up the escrow account. Same for taxes. We're handling the tax escrow, and we're also handling the tax proration. In this case, it was a debit. It wasn't a proration, but you get the point. And then same for insurance. We're handling the insurance escrow down here, and then the insurance premium up here. So those three things show up twice, accomplishing different objectives on the settlement statement. All right. We've got our escrows done. What's next? Now, the heavy lifting's done. There's only one more calculation to do, and we'll get to that when we reach it in the list. But now it's pretty much just, what do each of these individual items count toward? Who do they get attributed to? And the attorney fee, pretty much for our purposes, is going to be a buyer debit. The only attorney fee that's going to be a seller debit is deed prep. So the big one, $750, going to be listed as a debit on the seller column. So we'll go there, $750. Oops. $750 for attorney. We've got title insurance premium of $211.35. That's another buyer debit. We've got just did this one. Now we got deed preparation. That's a seller expense, like washing the car. So that one will show up on the seller debit column, which is right about here. $200. Oops. Deed prep. And then we've got deed recording fee for $25. That's going to be a buyer debit. And then we've got mortgage recording fee of $45. That's another buyer debit. Excise tax, there's our last calculation we need to do. So what do we do for excise tax? We need to know the purchase price. It was $193,750. Calculate that excise tax for me. You got it. $1 per 500. So we're just going to take that 193,750 and divide it by 500. Then we need to round it though. Don't forget the rounding. What do we round it by? It's 387.50. But the government says, we don't want your change. We want your dollars. Round up to the next dollar. So that needs to show up as a $388 item. Good job. That $388. It's going to be for excise tax. It's a seller debit. Sorry, I cluttered up our, let me fix that. There we go. Let's get rid of that. Now, last couple things. We've got survey of 540, pest inspection of 85. Both of those buyer debits. Pest was 85. Courier fee to mail the loan documents to the buyer's lender, $40. Since it's the buyer's loan documents, that's their expense. But the next one, the loan payoff to the seller's lender, is a seller expense because it's paying off that seller's loan. So that's 40. And I think that's it. That was a long journey. Let's recap. Let's look at our sheet here. Credits to the seller should be the purchase price. We got that. Yep. Not the taxes this time because we needed to debit for the taxes. And that's it. I think that should be all for the seller credits. So that's a pretty easy column. And then it's just a matter of going down through the columns and totaling everything up. So let's total all that stuff up. I've got 1623.04 for the tax proration or the double debit, plus 35 plus 123 for the payoff, plus 96.87 for the commission. Then that's all the way next down is the 200. Oops. Yep. Okay. 200 for the deed preparation, plus 388 for excise tax, plus 40 for that courier fee. So our total under this column for the seller is 138,438 and 54 cents. And then the only credit for the seller was the price of 193,750, which will come on down here. Now we can pretty much just do that math. Which will show us that the seller is getting $55,311.46. Historically, I find that people don't have a problem with the seller side as much as they do with the buyer side. It's probably not a shocker because there's a lot more calculations on the buyer side. So let's do those. Now we're going to come over here. We've got pretty much just this little bunch of stuff that's under the buyer credit column. 2,100 plus 3,500 plus 174, 174 174, 375. Oops, holy cow. That's 179, 975 totaled up for the credits to the buyer's side. Does that make sense? That's earnest money, due diligence money, plus loan amount. So we'll go down here, put it at the bottom. Then we need to add up all of these, the big category, all of these ones. That's where the trouble lies. And that's why I do it this way. I have had someone recently in a post class, because we teach this in post. What she was trying to do, she had said, okay, well, let's take this 193 and add the 219, and then let's go ahead and subtract out these, and then we'll add back in these and subtract that. And I'm like, you're going to drive yourself crazy. The problem with doing it back and forth like that is you can never track down the problem if there is one, like a mistake. That's why I preach this. Total up this, total up this, total up this, and total up this. Then you can get to the bottom of it quicker if you have a problem, if you need to find a mistake. So we're almost there. Now we just need to add up the biggest column of things. And so let's do it. 193, 750 plus this 219, 96 for taxes, plus 637 for homeowners insurance, plus 26.15 for origination fee, plus 52.31.25 for discount points, plus 474.74 plus 713 plus 614.32 plus 159.24 plus 86.64 plus 750 plus 211.35 plus 25 plus 45 plus 540 plus 85 plus 40. There's easily a possibility that I've screwed that up. But let's see if you guys got it too. So there's all of our buyer debits. We're going to subtract from them the buyer credits. So that buyer needs to bring $26,222.50 to closing. And the seller is going to receive $55,311.46. The answer choices obviously will have a right answer, but they might also have wrong answers that are strategic. They'll probably have wrong answers that are off by just the tax amount if you had done the wrong tax calculation, or if you forgot the discount points. They might have an answer choice that's exactly this much less or this much more. So you might see the right answer. So if you have time, go back and check, especially this column. Go back and check that math one more time if you have some time left, to make sure that you didn't skip something. That's how you do a big problem. That way you're doing both at the same time, pretty much. Seller's getting how much, buyer's bringing how much, right? It took a while. Probably took us 20, 30 minutes to do that thing. But it was our first one. We did it together. You'll get to the point of where you're like, oh yeah, that's what you do. So I'll give you some practice ones, including this one. And I would suggest you go back and watch the live stream that we're doing right now as you follow along together. So I'll give you this as a PDF right now. There you go. In the chat, you can pull that up, download it. And I wonder if this will work. Oh boy. It's working. Here we go. Not pretty, but I will give you this thing that I just wrote out too. If you find a mistake, let me know. Oh. Okay, what's left? Let's take a look at, let's just do a recap of the calculations, and then we'll move on. So, month has 30 days, year has 360. In every case except interim interest, the seller pays day of closing, or in the case of rent, they get the rent for the day of closing. Interim interest, the buyer pays for the day of closing. To calculate get the daily or monthly, whatever you need to start with the annual. So if we're dealing with taxes, we're going to take that tax value times the tax rate to get the annual taxes. Same for loan amount times interest rate to get the annual interest. Then we convert those annual amounts into daily amounts or monthly amounts. If we're dealing with within the month, we need to get the per day. That's what I wanted to show you. This part. You can do a screen cap of this, I believe. Yeah, that's right. Good. What do we do with taxes depending on when in the year? I kind of gave you one by hand maybe last night or last week, but here's another one, a little better written. And that's it, guys. That's closing procedures and closing calculations. A big chunk of the calculations. There's not much left of things that we have to do calculations for. What's left is the property valuation. There's some calculations in that, and that's what we're about to cover tonight. There we go. So what we're going to talk about in Unit 13 is a big part of our daily responsibilities, or at least weekly, the day-to-day stuff, right? What we talk about, what people want to know when they strike up a conversation with us. They will inevitably find out, oh, you do real estate? Well, I've been wondering what my house is worth. So this valuation thing is big. Closing is big. Contracts, agency, and this valuation one for the test, there's a handful of questions about it. At least one, maybe two calculation ones. So it's all about how to figure out what a property is worth. And so we also compare it to how an appraiser does it. We're not appraisers, but they're better at it than we are. But we do it similarly. We use the same sources too. The appraiser is going to also have a subscription to the multiple listing service, and that's where they're going to pull the history of things that have sold. And we too do the same method as brokers. We pull from the MLS what things have sold for that are similar to this property that we're trying to figure out the value of. So we're going to compare, talk about that. Learn some definitions of value, look at the appraisal process. What does the appraiser go through? And compare the three different approaches to coming up with the value. There's the sales comparison method. There's the cost approach. There's also the income capitalization approach, which we'll look at too. So first of all, an appraisal is nothing more than an opinion of value. That appraiser has an opinion, and it says so right there on the report, top of the page. It says, this is the appraiser's opinion. It looks very scientific. See if I can pull something up that I want to share with you. But at the end of the day, it's based on a lot of guesses, frankly, and educated, let me say it that way, educated guesses from the appraiser. Sorry, one second. Trying to find something. That wasn't it. Okay, I'll do this. I'll just go with this. I'll show you on the review. It's a prettier version of these things. But so the appraisal done by the appraiser, not us, but an appraiser, is just still their own opinion. And they have to be licensed. They have a governing body like we do. We have the real estate commission over us. They have the appraisal board over them. And it's also for a specific property on a specific date. So tell me this. How long do you think an appraisal is good for? How long does that appraisal report, that appraiser's opinion report, how long is it good for? Tell me in the chat. Chat it up. It's a good guess. 90 days. Give me something else. Some people say good through closing till another one's done. That's a good one too. But think about this. What is the appraiser using to determine the value of the property? Brokers or appraisers, either one. We're using similarly sold properties. Similar properties to the one that the subject is the one we're trying to determine the value of. Properties that are similar to the subject property that have sold recently, that are near it geographically, closer the better, same neighborhood ideally, that are similar in style and size and type of exterior siding, like brick instead of vinyl. Garages, 2-car garage, 3-car garage, hopefully the same. And so any differences between the subject and any of those comparables is adjusted for. You come up with a dollar amount that brick is worth. The fact that the comparable has brick but the subject does not means we need to figure out how much the brick is worth. 4 sides of brick. And maybe it's like $12,000 per side. Maybe it's $15,000 or $20,000 per side. It depends on the neighborhood. I had an appraiser once Chuckle laughed when he told me. He said, yeah, I had somebody the other day ask me for my binder. They said, could you give me your binder or let me see it or make a copy? He's like, what binder are you talking about? And they said, oh, the binder where you have all the adjustment amounts, like for a garage or for brick or for square feet. There is no binder. There is no universal level set of adjustments. It depends on the area. If you're out in the country, that's going to be a different dollar per square foot to make an adjustment between the subject property and the comparable. So if the subject property that you're trying to determine the value of has 2,000 square feet and the comparable that sold a mile down the road had 2,300 square feet, it's bigger. You've got to figure out how much 300 square feet is worth. You don't use the number that it would cost to build it from scratch, because that wouldn't be a good representation because it's not a new house. You've got to use a fraction of what it would cost to build new as a dollar per square foot. And that's all based on the appraiser's experience or the broker. Their experience level, their knowledge of the neighborhood, the level of upgrades, the price point. $1 million neighborhood is going to have a different dollar per square foot value than a $200,000 neighborhood, right? Same for any of the other differences. How much is brick worth on a Lake Norman waterfront home? Less or more dollars for a side of brick than in a random neighborhood that doesn't have a lake frontage, right? So it's all of that, and it's all based on experience. So you as a brand new broker, when you do your first market analysis or CMA, comparative market analysis, going to be eye-opening, right? It's going to be educational, and you're going to be glad and thankful you have a broker in charge to walk you through it. And if you have a broker in charge willing to do it, or a mentor, someone to let you shadow them on a listing appointment, and while they're preparing for the listing appointment, while they're doing these calculations, determining what something is worth based on what others have sold for, that's a huge part of this business, right? So we're going to compare what brokers can do to what appraisers can do. We're not allowed to do the same things that appraisers do. More specifically, we as brokers can't call what we do the same things an appraiser can. We would never say to a seller, I'll come to your house, do a listing appointment, and at that appointment, I'll show you the appraisal I've prepared. That's not allowed. We can't call our analysis an appraisal. That's a testable question. Write that one down. Brokers do CMAs or BPOs. Appraisers do appraisals. So I would say flip to a new piece of paper, write broker on one side, appraiser on the other side, and make a list. Brokers do a CMA or a BPO. BPO means broker price opinion. CMA means competitive market analysis. We'll see those on a slide here in a minute. That's what a broker can do. What we do can't be called an appraisal. And then also, an appraiser gives, once they do their appraisal, what they're coming up with is a market value. They're saying the value of your property is this. We, as brokers, aren't even allowed to say that. We can't say, hey, seller, I did a CMA and the value of your property is $375. Nope. We would have to say, I did a CMA and your probable selling range or your probable sales price is going to be $375. You have to call it a probable sales price. You can't call it a value. Write that one down too. And it's even better, the commission says, that the broker doesn't even give an exact number, but says your probable sales price range is somewhere between $370 and $380. And that's just smart business, on top of the fact that the commission prefers it. It's probably why they prefer you do it. Because if we give it to them as a range of value, that gives you some cushion as the broker, because you don't know yet if they're going to do everything that they promised they're going to do to prepare the home to sell for the most money. They might promise you they're going to pick up all the laundry and clean up the dog area and the cat box and keep that out of sight, and maybe repaint that one room with the crayon marks on the wall. But they might not. And if you promise them the very top of the market that you came up with, but they're not willing to do what they promised, that's not fair to you either. So the way I like to present it to a seller is I say, look, seller, I call them by their name. The probable sales price range is 370 to 380, but this is going to depend on you, how well you present your house, the condition you show it in, and also how fast you want to sell it. If you're going to tell me that timing is worth as much or more important than price to you, then the lower, the quicker. The lower we price it, the faster it should sell. So that's a real thing. Some sellers might say, you know what, I'll give up a few thousand if it means I can get it under contract in the day and go ahead and get a closing and get out of here because my company is transferring me and I don't want to have the family split up. And what also happens when companies are relocating buyers or employees, they will offer to buy the employee out, buy their house from them. But what they typically do is buy it out for a lower price than that employee could sell it on the normal market. So they give them an amount of time to get it sold themselves. And so they're incentivized to get it sold sooner than later, right? You need to learn all that stuff, find it out, ask them what's going on, what's the situation here. That's a whole different ball game than if it's somebody who doesn't need to sell in any amount of particular hurry, right? So an appraiser does appraisals for a specific property on a specific date. This is what I was getting around to. So what if they do an appraisal for today? They do all their work. They compare it to the comparable properties. And the closest comparable to this subject property they can find is around the corner, different street, same neighborhood, but it's 400 square feet bigger than the subject property. And it's a brick home instead of a hardy plank siding. And it's 3-car garage instead of 2. So the appraiser had to make all 3 of those adjustments. And anytime you're making adjustments, there's some leeway, some wiggle room for error also. How much is a buyer willing to pay for a house with a 3-car garage compared to a 2? I mean, we're just trying to pick a number that we think might be right, but especially when a market is moving as fast as this market does, there's a lot of room for error. So we do the appraisal, or the appraiser does the appraisal today based on the most recent 3 comparables that they have available that have sold. But there's also 2 or 3 more comparables that aren't closed yet. They're still under contract in the multiple listing service. And here's something else you need to know. If it's an under contract listing or active listing, you can't use it on the appraisal because you don't know how much they sold for yet. Even in the MLS, when you see things that are under contract, we're not allowed to put that contract price in yet until it closes. The reason for that is to protect the seller. What if it doesn't end up closing? Now you've told the whole world what the seller was willing to take. And it didn't end up closing. Now that seller is at a disadvantage. So under contract listings, you see under contract or pending, all we still see of those is the asking price, not the actual sale price until it closes. So all we have to go on are closed comps, things that actually did close. That's what the appraiser and we as brokers are supposed to use in calculating how much we think the subject property should sell for. So the appraiser's done the appraisal today, printed it off, turned it in, emailed it to the lender. But then tomorrow, a better house, an even more similar house, even closer to the subject property, maybe the exact square feet instead of 300 feet bigger, maybe also brick instead of hardy plank, same kind of siding, same size, same garage numbers. And that's a much better indicator of what the subject is worth than something that you have to make 14 different adjustments on. Does that make sense? So therefore, the appraisal is pretty much only good for the day it's printed. How long is the appraisal good for? Pretty much while it's still warm from the printer. Because tomorrow it could kind of be obsolete because there's an even better comp that pops up and closes for tomorrow that you couldn't use today because it wasn't closed today, but it's closed tomorrow. And that appraisal has to already be turned in. It's done. Too late. That does not mean that you have to redo the appraisal. They're still going to use that same appraisal for that particular transaction. But the point is, what's it good for? That particular day. I mean, you can use it for that transaction, but it could become obsolete when another one that's an even better match for the subject property ends up closing. And then that appraisal board makes sure those appraisers do these adjustments properly, that they're trained right, that they don't inflate the values. The appraisers have to prove that they really did the work and that they didn't just fraudulently say, yeah, okay, it's worth 380, but really it's worth 300. With a lot of the ones who misbehaved around that 2008 stuff, that's what they did. They inflated appraisals. And so it was fraudulent. It's fraud to the investor. The investor was thinking they were loaning money on a house that was worth 380, but they were really loaning money on a house that was worth 300. And so they gave too much money. And so that was loan fraud, defrauding the investor. Okay. So that's what an appraisal is. The CMA is what we as brokers can do. And it's an opinion of sales price, not an opinion of value. Brokers do it, again, specific property on a specific day, and it's the real estate commission that sets the standard of performance. They are the one who cares if we do it right or not. I don't know if you remember, but one of the first things we looked at in the license law and commission rules was about willful misrepresentation. And I think it's the second example in the comments PDF on willful misrepresentation. The example was a broker told the seller the property was worth $250 in order to get the listing. But from their research, they knew it was really only worth $225. And that's an example of willful misrepresentation that we could get disciplined for, lying to the seller to get the listing. Now, I have a feeling there might be at least one of those situations out there in the market right now. At least either one or 100 or maybe 300. There's a lot of listings. There's a lot of brokers who want to beat out other brokers to get those listings. And I have a feeling it's pretty tempting for a broker to tell a seller what they want to hear, despite what their research reveals that the property should sell for. So it's something that probably happens a lot. Now, a CMA is what a broker can do. A broker can also do a BPO. That's right there in your notes that you just wrote down. But here's the difference between the CMA and the BPO. The CMA is something that we do as part of our listing duties. They have called us to list their property. So part of doing our preparation to list their property is a market analysis, a CMA. And therefore, we don't charge for the CMA. We're getting paid for that at the end when we get our commission for having sold the property. It's sort of included in the many other things that we do as part of working for that seller. So a CMA is done for a client as part of our fiduciary duties, but a BPO is different. It's different in that we do it for a different relationship person. We do it for a customer, not a client. A BPO is still an opinion of selling price, just like a CMA. It's done the same way. It was done with the same adjustments. It's something we brokers do for a specific property on a specific date. It looks the same as a CMA. Everything's the same except a BPO is something you can do for money. I want to know what the value of my house is. I don't want to list it. I'm going to be for sale by owner, but if I pay you $100, broker, will you give me a BPO to tell me what approximately you think my house should sell for? That's what we're talking about. A broker price opinion, or BPO, is done for a third party, not a client. It's not what you do for your seller as part of fiduciary. It's what you do for a customer basically to make the money for having done it. And you're one and done. That's it. That's all you're doing for them. Here, I'll sell you my expertise in determining the probable sale price of your property. Who do you think might be someone that wants to know what their property is worth and therefore willing to pay a broker to tell them that and do a BPO for them. What types of people or companies or entities might pay for a BPO? For sale by owner, yeah, but also a bank. A bank might pay a broker to do a BPO so that they can decide if they want to foreclose on the property or not. Remember, they don't have to foreclose automatically just because you missed your first payment or your 14th payment. They decide, they think about it, and they might want to know, well, gosh, they've missed 3 payments. Let's get a broker to do a BPO, and then let's see how much this house is worth now. They owe $150. They originally got the loan for $200. It's been like 10 years. They've paid down to a loan amount of $150. So let's see what we could get for it. See what it's worth on the market. Did it go up to $250 or $300? So if you're a broker doing a BPO, it might be a bank that asks you and is willing to pay you to do this, to give this broker's price opinion of what the property should sell for. You're not going to make $1 billion doing these. It's probably going to make you maybe 75 or $100. Tends to be what brokers and FSBOs are willing to pay you for such a thing. The question is not, should I do it? The question is, how long will it take me to do it? If it only takes you an hour and you can make $100 to do it, yeah, I'll work for $100 an hour, but it's probably going to take you longer because you basically have to do it the way they want you to, using their little online interface, plugging in numbers into a bunch of different boxes and show them 3 things that have sold, plus another 3 that are under contract, plus another 4 that are actively listings. And maybe even they want you to go by and go see it in person and take photos. So now you're up to 2, 3, or 4 hours. Okay, now they're paying you $100 and it took you 5 hours. Are you okay with $20 an hour? Maybe. Maybe you are. But if it's, do I want to spend time on this BPO or go show a house to that buyer where I could make $120 an hour, then yeah, maybe I don't want to do this BPO. So there's more than just doing it for the money though, because a lot of people leading up to 2008 were lucky enough and had earned the right from banks because the banks had them do a BPO for them. And they were like, okay, sure. The bank maybe paid them $75 to do a BPO, and they gave them another one, and they did another good job with that. And the bank just started always calling that broker, to always do the BPO. So then when the bank finally did foreclose on a property, now they owned a property as what's called a REO property. If you ever heard that term, real estate owned is what that stands for. Real estate owned by the bank. And the bank wants to hurry up and get that thing sold because the bank wants to work with money, not real estate. So if you've been doing BPOs for them for the last year and you've done like 20 or 30, they might give you a chance to be their listing agent for that REO property. So that's another reason a broker might be smart to do a BPO, even though they're basically getting paid nothing. But that's how that works. A BPO is not done as part of your listing duties. That's what a CMA is called. It's just what it's called. Semantics, right? BPO is what you do for a third-party customer. So if a buyer or seller wants to know the value of a property, they would hire a who to do a what? If you want to know the value, hint, hint, value, who do you hire to tell you what the value of the property is? An appraiser is who can tell value. Brokers can't tell value. What if it had said, if a buyer or seller wants to know the probable sales price of a property? Okay, now a broker can do it. Then the next question is that seller asking you this because they want to list their house with you? Then what it would be called is a CMA to determine the probable sales price. Or no, they just want to sell it themselves, but they want to know your opinion because they know you do a lot of business in the area. Then they're going to hire a broker to do a BPO, right? let's have our break. That's what that one is. We'll come back and talk about some elements of value. welcome back. Okay, let's talk about some elements of value. Another acronym for you, the acronym DUST. Things that affect value of a property include the desirability, right? The more someone wants it, the more they're willing to pay for it. The more that multiple people want it, the more the seller is going to get, because lots of people are willing to pay for it. Utility affects value because what can the buyer do with it? If they want to buy this property because this house is in a neighborhood that allows them to operate their business from home, they're willing to pay more money for that house compared to a house that's in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association restriction against letting people operate home-based businesses. Big deal these last couple of years, right? Some HOAs have rules against letting people come and go, like park a lot of cars parking in the driveway, or maybe it's a home-based business that's a dog kennel, and there's a bunch of noise from dogs in the backyard barking in those kennels. So utility can really affect it. Scarcity. That's what we're dealing with now. We still have a very very significant shortage of listings, homes available for sale. So buyers are fighting over them. There's a lot of things online about the market and where it's headed this year. But I was just watching some stuff today and looking up some things, and we're still in a multiple offer situation kind of market across the country. For the most part, it's definitely softened compared to last year this time, but we still have a shortage of inventory. And so scarcity affects value, usually makes it go up, right? Because buyers are willing to pay more to beat out other buyers for the few that there are to pick from. Transferability affects the value because how hard is it to buy this property and transfer it from the seller to the buyer? Transferability would include things like maybe it has a cloud on the title, and so it's tough to clear up that title cloud and transfer it to the buyer. Therefore, the value goes down. Maybe the property has a bunch of liens against it, and the seller can't afford to pay off those liens, but is going to sell the property to a buyer who's willing to also have to pay the liens. If you're a buyer and you want to buy a property, but when you buy it, you're going to have to pay $20,000 of liens because the seller can't afford to, are you going to be willing to pay full market price for that property? No way. In fact, you're not even going to want a discount of only $20,000. You're probably going to want a discount to like pennies on the dollar. You're going to want to pay maybe 80% or 70 or 60% of market value. And then you buy it, then you pay off the liens, and you still have some built-in equity in the property, right? That's the kind of buyer that's willing to pay for a property that has liens on it, someone who's getting a really good deal, because that transferability affects value. So a property has all of these qualities in some amount of relativity to each other to have any value. Here's some terminology. Market value means what the property probably is worth, what it will probably bring once it sells. So market value. Value is what the appraiser thinks it's going to be worth, thinks it's going to sell for, says that it's worth today. The probable price. The sales price or the market price is what it really did get. So the difference between market value and sales price is time. Market value means we don't have a buyer yet. It's not been sold yet. We just think it's worth $350. Sales price or market price means a buyer was willing to pay $350 and it closed. So we know for a fact it's worth $350 because it sold for $350. So sales price or market price means that it is a sold property. Cost is the fun one out there in the market because this is what the owner has spent on the property. They bought it, and in the last 5-10 years that they've owned it, they did some of their own work to it, maybe. They put in a pool. They spent $20,000 on a pool. And so you go to list the property because they want to sell it, and they say, well, I already know what my house is worth. Those 3 houses in the neighborhood that sold last month, they're pretty similar to mine, but they only got 300,000. But since I put in this pool last year, I want to sell mine for 325,000 because the pool cost 20 and I should get a little bit extra for my trouble. And you might have to have a conversation with them and explain, well, I would love for it to sell for that for you. I want it to sell for as much as it possibly can for you so that you're super happy. But unfortunately, I'm limited by what the market is willing to pay for houses like yours. So let me share with you my research that I've done in this CMA, comparative market analysis, and I'll show you what others like yours have sold for that had pools and versus no pools. And we'll see what happens when you have a pool. And what you're eventually going to have to tell them is, I'm sorry you spent 20 on a pool, but you're not getting 20 back for that pool. That's just not how pools work, probably, right? They might say, oh, I built this deck myself by hand. Took me every Saturday for 9 months. Me and my son did it together. And I've carved my wife's face in every corner post of this deck, and it's worth $800,000 because of this deck. And again, you're going to have a conversation. Well, I can appreciate the sentimental value of this deck. And you used gold-coated screws, but how does that translate to what a buyer's willing to pay for a house with a deck? To a stranger buyer that doesn't know you or your wife, they may not be willing to pay as much for that deck as you feel like it's worth. And that's a hard conversation sometimes, hard for them to hear. What I really do out there in the wild is if I feel like they feel their house is worth more and it's not right, that it's really not worth that much more, I won't really talk about the probable sales price right away. I'll show them rather than tell them. And I'll flip through the pictures of the similar properties that have sold and just show them all the photos of the interior and exterior. And for one thing, they'll say things like, oh, that's Bob's house, the neighbor down the street. Wait a minute. This says the sale price was $413. He told me he got $487. And I'll say things like, well, sometimes neighbors like to embellish. I don't know why the neighbors always lie. It's public knowledge what something's selling for. They do, though. And then they maybe don't realize that the neighbor, when they got that big price for theirs, they had done work inside. They painted. It looked all nice, like Joanna Gaines came by and put agreeable gray in there and upgraded the kitchen appliances. And these guys have the original appliances from 20 years ago. And so they'll see these pictures and see the list of all the features and upgrades. And eventually they'll say, gosh, wow, their house looks really good. Maybe ours isn't worth quite as much as we thought it is. I like that better rather than me having to say, nope, your house is much worse than that one. I would never say that. But I like for them to come to the conclusion on their own by showing them instead of telling them. Then I'm not the bad guy. Then I'm the person who they're hiring to help them against the world, help them get this thing sold. And then counsel them, should I put the money into upgrading the kitchen to be like the neighbor? Okay, do you want to? Do you have it available? And will you make that much more money from the selling your house after spending $15,000 on appliances and paint and this and that and the other? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the market we're in. And it also depends on their time frame and their willingness to go through the hassle. That's worth something too. So cost, that's a fun one. There are some other factors influencing value, economic factors, including social factors. Things like, is it a property that has an active homeowners association? Something like that, someone might be willing to pay for. The HOA fees are way more. In the university area in Charlotte, there's a neighborhood called Davis Lake. Pretty big neighborhood, it's older. And another one called Highland Creek. And back in the day, at least, Davis Lake had a very active HOA. They really had a lot of various groups for different interests people had. But it cost a lot for that HOA fee in that neighborhood. Highland Creek had a little bit lower HOA fee, no social groups, but they did have several swim and tennis sections in the neighborhood, like 4 or 5 someone could go to. And so it was just a trade-off. What do you like to do? Do you like the social aspect? Then Davis Lake might be your choice. Do you like to stay to yourself, but you want to have a pool? Then maybe Highland Creek. Maybe neither one. Maybe you don't want to even pay HOA fees. You just want to live in a house more in the country and you'll just pay for YMCA membership or something. So social affects value. Economic affects value too. What's the economy doing? What's the interest rate doing? Right? A year and a couple of months ago, the rates got down to 2.75% interest. And then within about 3 months, they went up to 3.5%. And then they went up a little more. And then they got all the way up to about 7.25% or so. And everybody thought they were going to 10, but they didn't. They came back down to 6.5% or so. And we're right around 6.8 right now. Not bad. In fact, 6.5 was about where they were in 1996 when I got into the business. And everybody was thrilled for that rate back then because it had been coming down in 1996. It had gotten up to 18% a few years before that. So it's all relative. What are you comparing it to? Compared to 2, not great. I think I just heard the stat today, 80% of loans are at 4% interest right now. All the mortgages out there are at a 4% interest rate or so. So those people aren't selling unless they have a really good reason to. They're in a good spot. If they were to sell, they're going to end up in a house with a 6.5+% interest rate, right? So they're going to need a really good reason to sell. And they might sell because they could make pretty good money on the house because it would be a listing that everybody would fight for, but it's all relative. If you sell and get a lot of money for your sale of your house, you've got to go buy one to live in now, right? So now you're not getting as great a deal if you're the buyer. So that's the big question. What is that really going to mean to the market and to agents being in the business, fighting for the business against other agents? Political factors, that has to do with taxes. The taxes have gone up, or the zoning. The zoning board, what are they voting for to go through, and uncertainty, like anytime an administration changes, presidents change, that can affect values of properties. People might not want to sell right away because they're waiting to see what's going to be voted on and decided to happen. Sometimes when new presidents come in, they think, well, we'll fund these things we want to accomplish by taxing or adding more fees to real estate transactions. I'm waiting for the excise tax calculation to change. It's been $1 per 500 for a long time, but somebody could decide to make it $1 per 600 or $1 per 400. Whenever a seller sells, they have to pay that tax, and that's going to affect something. They could decide to fund a whole new idea of something based on that. Physical, like natural disasters, affect value as well. There's also principles of value. So let's look at these as we go down through this list. First of all, the principle of anticipation. That affects value because you know something's coming, and so maybe you buy in that area because in a few years it's going to appreciate more because that new shopping center actually got built, came in through here, or a road, a new 485 interchange because of the outer loop that was built around Charlotte, or I think there's a couple loops around Raleigh. How close are you to those things, to things being built? Big companies coming in, like Corning coming into the Denver area around near Lake Norman. All that anticipation affects value, and an investor is smart to be watching the future, looking at what's being voted on for zoning changes and figuring out, okay, what's worth lower today but it's going to be worth more later. Principle of change, everything changes. That on the left is a picture of Charlotte 100 years ago. That's me on the bike right there. And that's Charlotte a little bit later, and here's Charlotte today. Those values change over time, right? Principle of competition. What else is out there? How much competition is there? And when there's not much competition, the values go up. When there's a whole lot of competition, the values go down because buyers can pick from lots of things. And right now we're in a limited competition. Sellers don't have much competition. Principle of conformity. Uniqueness is not ideal in real estate for the most part. The things on the far left, that lower left, that's pretty unique. A nice contemporary styled house. Looks like it's on some acreage maybe. So that's probably going to be worth a little more. But the one right dead center, that geodesic dome house, if it's in a neighborhood around some houses that look like the ones on the right, it's probably not going to sell for as much. Let's say they're both 3,000 square feet. The market tends to like properties that are uniform, that are consistent, that conform to others, to each other. And so those conforming style houses tend to hold value better. The oddballs, this literally in this case, the one shaped like a sphere, that's not going to do well. There's a few around here in the Concord area. There's one in a neighborhood called Poplar, I just blanked on it. It's not Poplar Glen, Poplar something else. And it's a bunch of traditional houses like the right side of the slide here. But then there's one round one, and it didn't sell for much. It took them a while to find a buyer because when you have a house like that, the rooms end up shaped like a triangle, right? Because it's not squared off. So it gets weird. The utility bill is pretty low because they are very efficient usually. But uniformity, conformity holds value better when it comes to real estate. Principle of contribution means those things the seller did may or may not have added value. They might have actually decreased, taken away. And a pool is classic. People spend a lot of money to put in a pool, but they probably aren't going to get it back when they sell it. Depends on how long it's been since they put it in. The best way to have a pool is to buy a property with one already in there. Because if you put one in, you're probably paying a premium that you're not getting back. Or maybe it's to upgrade a room in the house. Kitchens and baths tend to bring back your money dollar for dollar a little better because everybody likes the kitchen and the bathroom's important. So upgrading a 20-year-old house with new bath fixtures and lights and maybe taking out the tub insert and tiling it up, making a nice tile shower instead of the fiberglass insert that was there that's now all mildewed and discolored. That's a worthwhile effort. It's going to translate to good value for the property. But it also depends on others that they have to pick from in that price range. What else are they looking at besides yours? Yours needs a new updated kitchen. But what else are buyers seeing that are in the same price point as yours? Everything else has a new kitchen. Then guess what? You're going to need to either take less for yours or put in a new kitchen, right? So those sorts of principle of contribution affects value in that way. We talked about principle of highest and best use. And I'll just give you the spoiler here. This is the biggest question the appraiser is asking and answering in the appraisal. When they do that appraisal, they're asking, is the current use of this property its highest and best or economically, financially? Should that parcel of land be used for a parking lot? Or would it be better to build a building on it that you could rent out office space? In my case, this house I'm in, it's 1972 brick tri-level house on 5 acres, zoned industrial. Is it being used to its highest and best use? No way. What I should really do is get all of you to donate to my GoFundMe and round up a couple $1 million and put a mini storage business on this property. So hurry up and make some money selling houses so you can fund my business, right? That's the only reason I'm teaching is to get you to go to my I don't have a GoFundMe. I'm just kidding. But I'm definitely not using it to its highest and best use. The buyer's going to probably use it at its highest and best use, so that's why I'm selling it. Let's sell it to somebody who wants to do the proper thing with it, and I'll go on and live in a normal neighborhood for a change. since you guys won't cooperate and give me $1 million. The principle of substitution says that all things else being the same, two properties at different prices, the cheaper one's going to sell first, right? Swapping out one for another. It's also the principle around which that comparative market analysis is based. We're comparing similar properties and then making adjustments for the differences. So we'll get more into that in a minute. Principles of supply and demand. If that demand goes up and the supply doesn't change, more people want it, and there's no change in how many to pick from, then the price goes up. Those properties available are going to be able to get more money. If the demand goes down, those properties available are going to have to take less because fewer people want them. Or if the demand is unchanged but the supply goes up, there's more for a buyer to pick from, then the price goes down because people can pick lots of different things. Or the opposite, makes the price go up. So out of all of these things, how many highest and best uses for a property could there be at any one time? How many highest and best uses at any one time? Just one. At any one time, there's only one highest and best use. And that appraiser is going to make mention of that on the appraisal report. So speaking of that appraisal report, the process of doing the appraisal involves these steps. First step, define the problem. What are we hired to do? What is the appraiser hired to do? Figure out the value of this house at 123 ABC Street. They're going to need to determine the scope of the work to be done. Is this a commercial property I'm appraising, or is it a residential? Is it a condo or a townhouse? Is it a lakefront, beachfront? What is it? Then they'll actually go do the work, collect and analyze the data. They'll pull from resources like the multiple listing service or the tax record and see what similar ones have sold for, and then compare them to the subject property, making adjustments, making sure the subject property is being used at its highest and best use. So note the first step in the process is to define the problem. Continuing on, they will estimate how much the land is worth by itself compared to the improvements. Then they'll use each of the three different approaches to value we're about to learn. That's the sales comparison method, the cost approach, and the income method. So they'll use all three, and then they'll reconcile those values. That'll make more sense in a minute. And then at the very end, last step, the appraiser does the appraisal, which is the report showing the market value estimate. So the first step in the process is to define the problem. The last step is reconciliation, essentially. There you go. First step in the valuation process, to define the problem. Last step is reconciliation. So we mentioned three methods of determining value, three approaches. Here they are. Sales comparison method, and that's literally comparing sales to the subject property. We have a subject. We know how big it is, what it's got to offer. It's the one that we're either being hired to do a BPO for or do a CMA because we're hopefully going to get the listing. And or the appraiser is going to do the appraisal, but we're going to compare similar properties to the subject and then make dollar adjustments for the differences. So we'll learn that one first. Then we'll talk about the cost approach. The sales comparison method is something we do for single family condos and townhouses and land. That's the kind of properties we do the sales comparison for. But the cost approach is a little different. We do that approach, or the appraiser does, when it's a unique kind of property, like maybe an ex-post office, an old school, or an old government building, an old church that's no longer in service, something that's not unique, something that's really unique. There's not a whole neighborhood of old churches. How do you figure out what the value of a church is? It's no longer a church. You're trying to figure out the value of that building, and no churches have sold in years. So how do you figure that out? That's when you use the cost approach. Because what you do to figure out the value of a building like that is figure out how much it would cost to build it new, and then back out for depreciation and back out the land, and then go from that direction. And then another one, the third one, is the income method or income capitalization approach. That's what you use for a property that's an income property. Is it a duplex that's a rental? Then you're probably less concerned about what the sales comparison approach says it's worth than you are what the income approach says. Because the income approach looks more at this kind of thing. Where'd it go? These things. We'll get into these in a minute. The income approach requires looking at the financial statements and saying, what's the most this property could make in rent in a year? And then how much is it going to cost to run that property, to pay the taxes and the utilities and everything? And then what you're left with. And learn about something called a capitalization rate. So that's going to be the best approach to use if it's an income property, because you care more about the rent than you do comparing it to similar sales. So the appraiser is going to do all three of these approaches and then decide, okay, what kind of property are we looking at here? Is it a rental? Then the appraiser is going to give more weight to the value amount they got for the income approach than they are to the value they got from using the sales comparison approach. So let's see what those things mean. This is the one that we do the most as brokers, pretty much almost 100% of the time. For residential, at least, we are doing the sales comparison method to figure out what something is worth. When we do CMAs, when we do BPOs, we're using market data of things that have sold in order to determine what this subject property might sell for, right? Because we're a broker. Notice I didn't say what it's worth. I said what it might sell for. So it's for residential properties and also vacant land. If you're trying to figure out the value of a piece of dirt, use the sales comparison approach. Look up similar sizes of dirt and how much they sold for and compare it to this one. Figure out what the price per acre sold for of the ones that sold, compare it to this one. And what were those zoned for, their possible uses compared to this one? The subject property, what can you do with it? And did those perk for a certain size septic system compared to this one? Does it perk? Can you put a septic system on it? Or is it connected to the city's sewer system or close to those lines? Or are they right there at the street? You could pay to tap onto them. So that sales comparison approach is all about residential properties and vacant land. That's something to write down. Write that one down. What do we use the sales comparison approach for? That's a test question I've seen on practice exams before. We use it for residential and vacant property, vacant land. The data we need to do this sales comparison approach, in order to actually do those calculations, they need to be sold comparable properties, comps that have sold. Because if they're comps that are on the market or things that are under contract, we don't know what they got yet. If they're active on the market, they're not even under contract at all. Who knows what they're going to end up selling for? And what I like to call this, the listing price, I'll call it the wish price, because that's just what the seller hopes they get, right? We don't know if that's even reasonable or rational. So we don't use an active listing to figure out what something is worth. We don't use an under contract listing to figure out what it's worth, because even those, we don't yet know what that contract was written for. So to compare the subject property, figure out the probable sale price, we're going to use things that have sold. That's the best thing to use in collecting data. And then we need to compare it. So we need to pick really close matches so that we can make as few adjustments as possible. And there's a handful of categories that matter when it comes to making adjustments. One of the most important ones, right, or you tell me, in comparing properties, the subject property to one of the comparables that sold. We know what that one sold for. It sold last week. It was on 2 streets over in the same neighborhood. Should we use it as a comparison to make to this subject property when we're going to do a CMA to hopefully get the listing? What are we going to use? What do you think you look for when you're picking a good comp to compare the subject property to? Tell me in the chat. What do you pick? What are you looking for? Similarity in what sorts of features? And it's okay if you look at the slide. Square footage is big, right? It's a big one. You would not want to compare a 1,300 foot house to a 3,300 foot house. Making a 2,000 square foot adjustment would really skew the results quite a bit. It would be something an appraiser would never do. They would not want to make that big of an adjustment. Maybe 500 feet of a difference in square footage. Maybe 2 or 3 would be even better. What do you think the most important one is? The most important similarity, the closest possible thing to match up. What do you think one of the most important one to look for is? While you're saying that, everybody give me an answer. I once had she was a second-time buyer for me. I helped her with her first house. She bought a townhouse. She sold it. I helped her sell it. And then she wanted to buy her first single level or single family home. And we went into a neighborhood that she really liked, and it was a very popular neighborhood. This was probably 5 years ago. And we went under contract. They were asking $195,000 for this 3-bedroom ranch house on like half an acre in Charlotte. And $195 is what the asking price was, but we had to bid against 3 other offers. And she ended up having to pay $196,000 in order to win. And we did. We got it. We went under contract. 3 days later, she called me almost in tears because her dad told her that he thought we were overpaying because he did some research. And she said, yeah, I hate to bother you, Neil, but my dad kind of got me worried. He says that he's done some research. He's looked up some comparable sales and he thinks that we're overpaying. And I'm like, it's not unusual for a parent to chime in, right? And it's usually okay, but for one thing, you never know where they're getting their information. So I said to her, that's fine. I get that. He just wants to make sure you're making the right decision. So ask him what those comparables are and where he's gotten them. And so she did. And any guesses? Where do you think he was getting his information from of what similar houses have sold for? Yep, that's it. The Z word. And that's okay. But here was the problem. It wasn't the fact that it was Zillow or wherever. How old do you think the comps were that he was looking at? A year. And there was one for 2 years ago. And I'm like, see, that's the problem. Something that sold last year, or especially 2 years, is completely useless to figuring out what this house is worth today. An appraiser will never look at those comps. And the market is changing. So rather than look at those comps from a year or more ago and think you're overpaying, let's focus again on the CMA I did for you when we prepared your offer on this one, because I do that as a buyer agent too. And so these are the most recent comps that an appraiser actually will probably use when they do the appraisal. And I think it really helped when, like a week later, another house finally closed in there, and it was very similar, and it closed for $205. Dad felt much better when we had a recent, latest, hot off the presses, similar house that sold and closed for $10,000 more than what she was paying, or $9,000 more. Sometimes you got to educate the family, the advisors, the free advice givers, and that's sometimes challenging. But so recency is number one. How recent did a similar house close? How recently did something sell? We're not going to look at comps from a year ago, and hopefully not even 6 months ago. Hopefully no more than 3 months ago, if possible. If it is longer, like 6 months, I've seen appraisers make an adjustment for the fact that it was such an older comp. And they said, well, appreciation has been like 5% in the last 6 months. So it sold, the one down the street sold for $300,000 5 months ago, but the market appreciated 5% since then. So it's worth another couple thousand if it were to have sold today. So that kind of thing. So how recent? Area, that's another one. You're not going to compare a house in Concord to a house in Mount Holly, obviously, or even any further away than a couple or 3 miles if possible. You want as close to the subject property as you can. That can be challenging because some neighborhoods that might be like on larger lots, maybe to get to another house that has a lot that big, you're going to have to go further away in another similar kind of neighborhood. Hopefully it's in the same county. So that's an art form. Picking good comps before you even start making adjustments. Got to pick the closest things you can so that you don't have to make many adjustments, because that's the best shot at getting a good probable sale price. Somebody I think mentioned style. That is very important. Especially if we're talking about like 1 story compared to a 2-story. That's a big deal. Why does that matter? Looks like this. If it's a 2,000 square foot home and it's a 2-story home, 2,000 square feet can fit under the roof and look like that, right? 1,000 up here and 1,000 down here. If it's a 2,000 foot ranch, it's going to need to be, I'm running out of space. It's going to need to be even wider, right? So a couple things. First of all, the footprint is bigger. This big compared to this big, like it's double the footprint. So it needs to be on a larger lot usually. Also, the roof materials are going to be more because it's got to be a bigger roof to get over 2,000 feet this way versus 1,000 feet stacked, right? So it's going to be cheaper to build a 2-story than it is a single story. So single stories or ranches are worth more typically. And so if your subject property is a ranch, you're not going to use 2 stories to compare it to. You would compare a ranch to other ranches. So you've got 2 stories, 3-story houses, ranch, also known as 1-story. You've also got things like a tri-level, which is kind of a weird one because with a tri-level, you might go in on the main story, but then you have to go up some stairs to get to the bedrooms up here. And then you go down some stairs to get to some more living space down there. And so you're always living on the stairs. So if anything, that tri-level is probably better if you don't have any others to compare it to. Maybe compare it to a 2 or a 3-story. But ideally, compare it to other tri-levels. But sometimes you just don't have them to pick from. So the style is important to do. And as far as testing on this in this class, just know that you're not going to compare a 2-story with a 1-story. That's the most important part there. So style, age is helpful because that also has to do with condition, possibly. Maybe the condition it's in is because it shows that it's 25 years old. So all of these are important. And then other things like garage, the type of siding, brick versus vinyl, extras, amenities like pools or detached garages, or how many total garages. Is it in a neighborhood with an HOA? And then one of the comps you found that's a really close match to the house size but it's in another neighborhood that doesn't have an HOA. And so there is an adjustment for that too, because houses in neighborhoods with HOAs tend to sell for more money than when you're in a non-HOA neighborhood, even though a lot of people have strong feelings about not wanting to live in an HOA. The sales comps seem to support more value in HOA neighborhoods. I think the biggest reason there is probably because the point of the HOA is to keep people from doing things that bring down the value. You can't put that car up on blocks in the front yard, right? You can't put a very bold colored front door and shutters on the house. You've got to use a certain type of color or a certain size and type of fence. Another thing about picking comps is making sure they're similar in the seller's motivation. You're not going to, if it's a normal sale for the subject property, your seller is just selling because they want to move, not because they have to sell because they're facing foreclosure, then you're not going to pick a foreclosure comp. Don't use a comparable that's sold because of foreclosure, under some kind of duress. So similarity in terms of that is also important. Another one is something called an arm's length transaction. Did that comparable that sold sell, was it a parent selling to a child, their adult kid? Or I had one time and my listing was appraised. It was like March of 2020, like the first sale in COVID. And so we didn't know anything to do back then. So the appraiser didn't even schedule an appointment. That was highly unusual. And he knocked on the door and my poor seller was home with her infant newborn. Thankfully her mom was with her, but he just shows up unannounced. That's unusual. They're supposed to make appointments. And he opened the door. She opened the door. He said, I'm not going to walk through your house because of COVID, but I do need to walk through to get to the backyard, take a picture of the back, took a picture of the front, and then I'm out of here. I don't want to measure the house because I don't want to be here any longer than I have to. None of it made any sense. On top of that, he used my measurements. That's pretty unusual too. The appraiser measures, they're supposed to measure. And so he went back and not only did he do all of that wrong, he appraised it for $11,000 less than sales price. So now we have a sales price of like, maybe maybe like 180, and he appraised it for 169, something like that. So one question I had was, what are you looking at? Because I'm very careful when I list something. I don't just throw a price on it to get it. I want to make sure I see what things are selling for. He used a comparable from around the corner that was a ranch. This was a 2-story. It was bigger, but it sold for a lot less. And nothing in the MLS remarks section was any indicator of what was unusual about it. So I called the agent. I said, you had a closing on a listing that sold like a month ago. Could you tell me about that situation? I'm just curious. I see that it sold for less than what I would have expected it to. And they said, oh yeah, that was unusual. It was, first of all, an estate sale. The actual owner died, so it was their kids that were selling it. And so when it's an estate sale, usually the person who's getting it in the sale, in the estate, they don't really care about maximizing value quite as much as an owner does. They just want to cash out and get it money and go. It was never theirs. Dad died, left it to me. Let me just sell it and get what I can out of it and move on with life. So number one, that was unique. And then secondly, the agent said also they sold it, the kids sold it to a friend of theirs. So that wasn't really arm's length transaction. That wasn't stranger to stranger. They gave their friends a deal on a house that never was even theirs. They inherited it. So two of those things together meant that totally explained why it was such a terrible comp. But this appraiser never even bothered to make the phone call to find out. And it didn't get put into the MLS as being, they really should have put that in the MLS as an explanation so appraisers would know. But he was so busy and he just didn't care. We filed an appeal. Me and the other broker both wanted to get him to change it because it was just messing up the situation, the transaction, and he wouldn't. Their process was ask him to redo it, are you sure you're sure about this appraisal? And he said, yep, I'm confident. I stand by my work. And so my seller had to make a decision. Were they willing to lower the price or at least all the way down to the appraised value? Because remember, the buyer can only get the loan for the lower of the two, whether it's sale price or appraised value, whichever's lower. And I can't remember. It might have been that the buyer was willing to throw a little more money in their down payment and meet somewhere closer to the middle. But I'm pretty sure it was, the seller had to come down almost the entire way. But he was willing to. It worked out. Most things do. But that was not exactly a good comparison. That never should have been the same comp. A good comparable for this particular listing. Okay. When it comes to this sales comparison approach, we've got a subject property. And let me show it to you this way. We've got a subject. That's the one that we're trying to figure out the value of. And then we have a comparable. Probably three. The lender usually wants at least three comparables to be looked at. Sometimes they'll ask for even more. But let's compare that subject to the first comparable. Let's say the subject has 3 bedrooms. And so does the comp. That also has 3. The subject has 2,000 square feet. The comp has 2,500 square feet. The subject has a 2-car garage. The comparable has a 1-car garage. And let's go with that for now. So what else do we know? Do we know what the subject is selling for? What the subject is worth? No, we don't know that. That's all a question. We do know if it's something under contract, that's when the appraiser is going to be hired. But they don't know what it closed for yet because it hasn't closed yet. They do know what the contract price is, but that's not good enough. But we do know that the comparable sold for $350,000 because it closed already, and that's how much the seller got for it. We know that absolutely, no question. So, rule number 1 in the sales comparison method, adjust the comp, not the subject property. And if you think about it, that makes sense because how dumb to try to adjust the subject property when you don't even know what they got yet. You adjust from this 350. You can't adjust from a question mark. That's all that is on the subject. So using this 350, let's figure out what a garage is worth for one thing. Let's say in our research, we determined that 1-car garage is worth $11,000. And we also determined that a square foot is worth $45 per square foot. Well, the comp has 1-car garage. The subject has 2. A garage is worth $11,000. So we need to do something with $11,000. And so here's where you hold out your hands, right? And you say the subject in this case has 2-car garage. The comp has 1-car garage. So the subject is superior to the comparable. It's better than. It's got more stuff in terms of a garage. It's got 2 instead of 1. So therefore, the subject doesn't change. We can't do anything with the price of the subject. We need to make our adjustments to the comparable because we know what they got. They got $350. What do we need to do to the comparable to bring it up to the level of the subject? It's down here with a 1-car garage. The subject has a 2-car. We need to add a garage to the comparable. Add. We can't physically do it. We're going to add dollars in lieu of the garage to what the comparable sold for. So if that comparable is inferior to the subject, then we need to add $11,000 to the $350. In other words, if that comparable had a 2-car garage instead of a 1, they would have theoretically gotten $361 instead of $350. You with me? Now the square footage. we've got a 500 square foot difference here. 500 square feet times $45 a square foot is what? An amount of $22,500 difference. But in this case, the comparable is bigger than the subject. It's better. So we've got the subject here and the comparable up here better. We need to bring the comparable down to the level of the subject. Subtract. So this time we're going to subtract from what the comparable got. We're going to take away that $22,500 from the price. So if this comparable had the same square footage, had only 2,000 instead of 2,500, and had a 2-car garage instead of a 1-car, then instead of $350, we need to add for the garage and subtract for the square feet. So it theoretically would have sold for $338,500 instead of $350. And we do that with several other things. Maybe we also adjust because it was brick compared to vinyl. Maybe maybe an upgraded kitchen or bath, or maybe it's an older comp, so we need to add for appreciation, like 5% appreciation in the last 6 months. All kinds of different adjustments are going to show up on that appraisal and maybe even our market analysis. Condition, that's an important one to point out. Sometimes I'll make a reference of it in my actual, as I'm going through it with them, but I won't put a dollar amount to it. I'll just say, look guys, this one down the street adjusts out to $338,500, but they also had a newer kitchen, and you guys just said you'd have an older kitchen and you're not willing to put the time or money into it. So therefore, if they got $338,500 with a new kitchen, then yours is going to be worth less than that. Right? How much less? Depends on how much less of a kitchen it is. Right? Is it all matching brand new compared to yours 20 years old mismatched? Maybe as much as 10. Maybe 5, maybe 10. Who knows? So that's the concept, and that's sort of the math you would be looking at doing in the test. First of all, how to adjust a comp to match up with the subject. Nothing crazy. It's probably not going to be more than maybe square footage or garage or bedrooms or bathrooms. And then whether you add or subtract to that comparable sales price, depending on its comparison. Was it better than the subject? Then we need to subtract from what they sold it for. Was it worse or inferior to the subject? Then we need to add to the sale price of that comp. We'll do some more of those when we come back from break. I'll see you in 10. finish out this hour. Hopefully before you know it. Got a few minutes to go. We'll talk about the sales comparison method. Nobody's here yet. Okay. Okay. All right, let's talk about the sales comparison approach. First important point, adjust the comparable, never the subject. Comparable, never the subject. If that comp is inferior to the subject, we're going to add to what the comp sold for. If it's superior to the subject, we're going to subtract what that comparable sold for. So it might look like this as well. There's the subject property on the left. There's the comparable on the right. In this high-tech graphics we're looking at, that comparable has no garage compared to the subject that has a garage. Therefore, we need to add to whatever the comparable sold for to make up for the fact that it lacks a garage. It's inferior to the subject. That means you need to add money to what they sold it for. Here's one where there we go. In this case, the subject has the no garage, but the comparable does. So you would subtract if the comparable is superior. Let's look at an example. Mitch and Mary want to sell their 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. That home sits on a half-acre lot, was built in 1968, has a double-car garage and a sunroom. The best comparable property was built at the same time and has a 3-bedroom, 2.5 baths, half-acre lot, double-car garage, and no sunroom. Then they give us some data. Sales data indicate that a bedroom is worth $5,000, a bathroom is worth $6,000, a garage is worth $30,000, and a sunroom $45,000, and an acre is worth $100,000. So the correct adjustments would be what? What would we do? First of all, notice that in this kind of test question, we didn't have to add up the numbers. They're all a $42,000 adjustment because in every case in this situation, the comp is, well, the 42 is not something that we have to worry about. We just need to know what to do with it based on the information given. So number 1, subtract 42 from the subject property. Is that going to be the right answer? Are we doing anything to the subject property, adding or subtracting to or from it? We never add or subtract to the subject. We only adjust the comparable property itself. So any of the answer choices that involve changing or subtracting or addition to the subject are going to be wrong. So that eliminates 1 and 3, or A and B. And so that just leaves, are we subtracting 42,000 from the comparable or adding to it? So we've got the subject and comparable both have 3 bedrooms. There's no change there. No adjustment needed. They both have a half an acre lot. No adjustment needed there either. However, yeah, same for the garage. No adjustment to the garage, but the bathrooms are different. The subject property has 2 bathrooms. The comparable has 2.5. And so that means we need to subtract $3,000. They're giving us the fact that a bathroom is worth 6, so the assumption here is that a half a bath is worth 3. So they're saying subtract 3,000 for the bathrooms, and then the sunroom. Sunroom is different too. The subject property has 1, the comparable does not. Since the subject is better than the comparable, it's up here. I don't know if you can see my picture. Subject is better. We need to add to the comparable to bring it up to the level of the subject. So if the comparable had a sunroom too, it would be worth $45,000 more than what it sold for. And that's it. We're going to make a $42,000 adjustment. We're going to add. So it's going to be number 4. Because we need to add $42,000 to what that comparable sold for to make up for the sunroom and the bathroom. And that's what you could see. So this wouldn't officially fall under the category of a calculation question, right? There's 8 calculation questions on the PSI. This wouldn't be one of those because we don't need to calculate it, really. We're just working with the 42,000. You just need to know what to do with it. Add or subtract from the comparable. How about this one? Broker Billy has a listing appointment for a 3,600 square foot home on 2 acres. It's on the main channel of a popular lake. 5 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, pool and spa, dock with a lift, cedar shake exterior, and a 3-car garage. The most recent sold comparable that matches up with this home has 3,800 square feet, so it's 200 feet bigger. It has 5 bedrooms, 4 baths, so an extra half a bath larger. Sold for $2,200,000. The recent sold home is also lakefront with a boat dock, no boat lift, and 3-car garage, and a brick exterior. The correct adjustment would be what? So if we had to add it up, let's see if we can do it this way. Here we go. We will let's see what the differences are. We have a subject and we have a comp. We've got where do we stand with the square footage? The subject has 3,600 feet. The comparable has 3,800 feet. The bedrooms are the same, but the bathrooms are different. Subject has 3.5 baths. The comparable has 4. Nope, sorry. Yeah, that's right. 3.5 and 4. The comparable, by the way, sold for $2,200,000. Now, boat dock, no boat lift. The subject has a boat dock and a boat lift, so the comparable does not. So No lift. How much is a boat lift worth? That is worth, according to this, does it even say? Okay, I see. We're not having to do the math. We just need to deal with the items. So no lift. What else? 3-car garage compared to, okay, same for both. They both have a 3-car, but the comparable has brick siding. The subject has cedar siding. So then let's go through and do pluses and minuses depending on the items. Does 3,800 square feet, is that superior to the subject? Yes. So we need to do what to the amount, to the purchase price? We need to subtract for the square footage difference. And the same for bathrooms. We need to subtract for a half bath's worth of value. We need to add because the comp has no lift, but the subject does. And we need to subtract because brick is worth more than cedar. So, what are our answer choices here? Are we going to add the value of the half bath? Let's see. Nope, we're not doing that because we realized that we need to subtract the value of a half bath. So it's not 1. Are we going to add the value of 200 square feet? Oops. Share this better with you. Add the value of 200 square feet? No, because we also said that the square footage needs to be a subtract as well. What about subtracting the value of the square feet and subtracting the bathroom? Let's see. We need to subtract the square feet and we need to subtract the bathroom. So that makes sense. Let's make sure that number 4 is not a better answer somehow. Are we subtracting the boat lift and adding a dock? Nope, we're not subtracting the lift. We need to add the lift because this comparable has no lift. So the best answer is 3. We're subtracting for square footage and we're subtracting for the bathroom difference. So 3 would be the best answer there. So that's what you're looking at. For the sales comparison method, you could see problems asking, what are you going to add or subtract? You might even have to do some addition or subtraction and figuring out that, but that's about the limit. That's about all you'd have to do on the test for a sales comparison. And then other things about that is always adjust the comparable sale price, never the subject. Compare as similar properties as possible. The style, 1 versus 2 story, you'd never do that. You want to compare 1 versus 1, 2 versus 2. Location, amenities, bedrooms, bathrooms, size, when it's sold, that's the most important one. Recency of it selling, an area, how far away is it? So all of those are sort of what you're looking for in the sales comparison method. Let's talk about the cost approach. This one is for unique properties. The sales comparison method works because we have a lot of sales to compare it to. But the cost approach won't work that way because there's just not going to be a lot of old school buildings that get sold that you have to pick from to compare to. So the cost approach involves this principle of substitution. The value of the property is determined by how much would it cost to acquire an equally desirable property. In other words, how much would it cost to build it new? But since it's not new, you have to also make an adjustment downward for however much less it is in condition, right? So, first step into doing the cost approach, determine the value of the land. How much is the land worth? Now, this means you're going to use the sales comparison method to figure out how much the land is worth. You'll determine what's the cost per acre for similar properties, similar amounts of acreage property. So determine that land value and then keep it off to the side, right? We're going to add it back in later because the next step is to estimate the depreciation. How much worse is it in terms of condition? How much has it depreciated over time? And we subtract that amount of depreciation from how much it would cost for it to be built new. So I need to probably really add a step in here. Estimate the land value, then determine the cost to build it new, and then subtract the amount of depreciation from that cost to build it new. Then add the land back in. Here's the important part of the cost approach. You can't depreciate land. Land can never be depreciated because it's dirt. The only thing you determine depreciation on is the structure itself, the improvement. Then you add how much the land is worth back to that depreciated amount for the structure. So, again, it's for properties that aren't sold very often. It's also not for income-producing properties. That means it's for fire stations, public hospitals, government buildings, schools, churches, things like that. We don't run into that as brokers usually unless you're in the commercial area part of the business, but an appraiser would. Appraiser might run into these types of unique properties, and so they would need to use the cost approach to figure out the value because there are no comparables, right? There's no recent comp. When's the last time a library sold, right? So first step, part of that process is determining the building cost. Estimate how much it would cost to build it. And that requires that we talk about this issue. The cost to replace something compared to the cost to reproduce it. Replacement value is cheaper than reproduction value. Replacement value just means we just need a new front door. Let's go to Lowe's, get a new front door. But if it's a historic property in the historic district, that means there's a zoning overlay. The zoning board has something to say about what you do with your historic property. They say you're in the historic district, so you've got to stay true to the period in which that house was built. You can't just buy a $300 door from Lowe's and stick it on the front. You're going to have a custom woodworker recreate a reproduction front door for a whole lot more than $300 probably. It's going to cost a lot more for reproduction cost compared to just replacement cost. Replacement is about function. Reproduction is about being true to the period, and they cost a lot more. So one strike against owning a historic property, right? It's going to cost more you can't just put any old thing on there. So how do we estimate the cost of this property to be built new? There's a couple of different methods. An appraiser likes that square footage method. How much do structures like this cost to build per square foot? This is a 3-level old high school building, and to build this new would cost $180 a square foot. I'm just pulling from air here. An appraiser would come up with how much would it cost to build per square foot for the other school down the road that sold or that got built. A contractor would use one of two methods. Either the basically stick-by-stick method, like the quantity survey method is what that's called. How many pieces of lumber, insulation, wiring, plumbing, how much supplies are we going to need to build this thing new? How much is it going to cost for shingles and bricks and mortar and all that stuff added up together? The quantity survey method is what that is called. The unit in place method is a little faster. In this case, the contractor's saying, well, how much does it cost to build a wall and then a roof? And then let's add these big chunks together, sort of like the idea of a modular home. How much does it cost for this many rooms in chunks? The unit in place method, just a little faster way to kind of figure out what it would cost to build something new. Whichever way they use to estimate the building cost, they're going to do that and say, hey, here's what it costs to build it new. Then they're going to depreciate they're going to subtract out for the depreciation from that cost to build it new. Then they're going to figure out what the land amount is worth using the sales comparison method, comparing it to other land that has sold, add that into that depreciated amount. So when it comes to figuring depreciation, there's a couple of things here to know. The effective age versus the economic life. The actual age is how old it really is. It's an 80-year-old building. The effective age is determined by the upgrades. They put in a new heating and air system 5 years ago, and a new roof 4 years ago, and new plumbing 3 years ago. So the effective age might be more like around 4 years old in terms of all those things having been updated, upgraded. So the effective age versus the chronological age. And then the economic life has to do with calculating that depreciation, and they kind of spread that out over time. We'll talk more about that. But depreciation is things like deterioration, the wear and tear that this structure has seen, the maintenance that it needs. Another term we'll run into is functional obsolescence. That includes the design features. Is it like a sunken living room? Is that something that people are into these days? Functional obsolescence. And then also economic depreciation can happen. Is it near an airport flight pattern? So therefore, it's worth less because of all that extra noise. Or down the road from the landfill. Maybe that's another issue. So some economic depreciation from factors outside of your control. You can't control that it's near an airport or that it's near the farm that smells like animal stuff half the time. Uncontrollable, uncurable, incurable. That's the other question. Of these different things that affect the depreciation, which ones are curable or not? Can you cure physical deterioration? Sure. Fix it, right? Upgrade it, update it, paint it. That's a curable thing. Can you cure functional obsolescence? Maybe. If it's like a structure that has maybe it has 5 bedrooms and only 1 bath. Well, it might cost a lot to add an extra bath, more than somebody would want to put into it. So that would be functional obsolescence that's not really curable. But maybe it is something that's a little less financially overwhelming. And so they could actually raise the floor of that sunken living room to make it all one level so that older people or people in wheelchairs might be more inclined to be willing to buy such a thing. So what is it, curable or incurable? The physical deterioration and functional obsolescence could be either one. But what is always incurable is the economic depreciation. The fact that it's worth less because it's noisy, because of the airplanes all the time, or the train tracks in the backyard. So those economic depreciation things you can't fix. You just have to give it less value because of those things. So the form of depreciation that is always incurable is what? Which of these kinds of depreciation are always incurable? You got it. Outside of their control. Nothing they can do about it. That's essentially the cost approach. And we'll do some math about depreciation later. But let's talk about that third approach to determining value. This one applies to income-related property, income producing. It's an idea of determining the present worth of the property based on its future ability to earn income. And so since it's a rental, an investor buying a rental property probably doesn't care as much what it looks like as so much as how much has it proven to draw in rent and when's the last time that they raised the rents. Maybe it's been 3 or 4 years since the rent has been raised, so that investor could buy it, and then it's about time for those rents to go up. So when it comes to this income approach, also known as the income capitalization approach, anytime you're dealing with something about investment, there's a rate, right? There's a rate of return. Anybody have a savings account? Do you know what the rate you're earning on that money in that savings account is? Not much. It's pretty secure. You're not going to have to worry about losing that money, but you're not making much money on your money that's in a savings account. However, Bitcoin probably could make some money on that, but it's also higher risk. Or investing in a coffee shop probably could make some money on that, but again, how well are they running it? Or the stock market, right? What are you investing in? You could you're looking for how much your money is going to make for you. Investing in a treasury bill might make you 5% return, but you're going to have to leave your money in it for maybe like a year. And so you'll get that treasury bill for $95, but you're going to it'll be worth $100 in a year from now. You just have to leave it alone. So what is your rate of return? That's what we're talking about with this thing called capitalization rate. A cap rate is just a measure of the value of an investment property. And so if an investor is looking for office buildings to invest in, they're going to do their research and see what buildings like that have as a cap rate. They will find out, wow, okay, how's office buildings like this have a cap rate of around, let's say, 7%. So if the cap rate is 7%, that's just one of the ways that they figure out what it's worth. It's based on that cap rate. And let's come back to that in just a second. But it's measuring the income versus the expenses and your return on your investment. What is your rate of return? Here's the overall formula. It looks worse than it is, so hang in there with me. The acronym is actually GIVEN, GIVEN. And let me see. Let's do it this way. Make a little more room here. There we go. So the acronym is this. And so the G stands for gross income. What's the most that property is going to make in a year? But let's say it's a 100-unit apartment complex. 100-unit apartment building. Are you going to have all 100 of those units occupied by people paying the rent all the time throughout the year? Probably not. You're going to maybe have 95 of those 100 units paying you rent because of things like vacancy. They're not always going to be filled up. And then also you're going to have to pay some money to collect from some of them that aren't good at paying their rent. You got to go after them in collections, and that costs you, the owner, some money too. So subtracting out from the gross income amount, the most it can possibly get in rent, subtract out for vacancy and collections. And that gives you this thing called effective income. Effective income factors out for the vacancy and collections costs. Now, we're all adults. We all pay things like lights and water and utilities, things like that. So that's what you have to do with an investment property too. You have to subtract out for operating expenses. And that's what that next part is. We're subtracting out things like utilities. It might be that you have to have a manager on site. You pay for somebody to be on site to manage the property. Maybe maintenance. You have a repair person, a maintenance person on site that does things. anything that it costs to run a business, pay those bills. You got to pay all those bills to run it. That's the operating expenses. When you subtract out for the vacancy, that vacancy right there, and the operating expenses here, what you are left with is something called NOI. Stands for net operating income. So if you're looking at buying an investment property, you would want to see the financial statements so that you could determine what the NOI is on this property. What's the NOI? And so that NOI is related to the value of the property in this way. Net operating income divided by the capitalization rate gives you an estimate of what the market value is. So how did we know the net operating income? We knew it because we looked at the financial statements, saw what the rent is they're charging, figured out how much would that rent make me in a year if everything was rented, all 100 units, subtract out for vacancy and collections, and then subtract out for all of the expenses associated with owning the property. That got us our NOI. So that's how we knew this. Maybe it's $1.5 million. And then the cap rate, we're going to learn by doing our research and finding out that properties like this have an 8% cap rate. And if that's the case, all we have to do then is just the math. Because when the NOI is on the top of the circle formula and the cap rate is on the bottom, because all rates are on the bottom, then divide the NOI by that cap rate, and that gives you an estimate of value of $18,750,000. So if you're shopping for this property, what's the asking price? If they're asking $20 million, you might decide you don't want to try to buy it. Or if you do buy it, you're going to offer them $18 million and try to end up somewhere around this number, because it's looking like from your research based on the NOI and the cap rate that that's all it's worth. Or if they're asking $15 million, you might get excited and think, wow, they only want 15, but from my calculations, it's worth more than that. I could walk in with some equity already. So that's how this stuff works. That NOI, that's what you need to know for the test. NOI is related to market value by the cap rate. NOI divided by the cap rate equals the market value of the property. How do we get the cap rate? We do our research and we see what other 100 unit apartment buildings have sold for. So let's say comp 1, comp 2, and comp 3 are other apartment buildings, same size. And the cap rate on this one was 7. The one on this one was 8.5, and the one on this one was 9. And so we could just say, well, that looks like about an average cap rate of around the 8.5. So I'm just going to use that as my capitalization rate estimate. And so let's look at one that's for sale. And this one that's for sale has an NOI of whatever it was I said a minute ago. And based on my research of cap rates for how properties like this, it's an 8.5% cap rate. So let's see what that would be. I'd said $1.5 million was the NOI. Let's go with that same one. Divide that $1.5 million by 8.5% cap rate. The property should be worth, in this case, $17,647,000 and some change. So that's kind of how this thing gets worked with. That's how this thing gets manipulated and somebody does something with it. So let's look at it here. Oh, there it is, still there. That NOI is the one in blue. I call that sort of the horizontal calculation. Notice something else here. NOI was what we got after we subtracted out operating expenses. But there's one more step, one more thing we can subtract that it costs to run this investment property. debt service. What is debt service? It's the mortgage payment. So NOI, net operating income, does not include the loan payment. Did you finance the property? Are you planning to borrow $1 million to buy this thing? Well, the monthly payment on that was not a part of NOI. And it's because the appraiser doesn't care if you own it all cash outright or if you borrowed money to buy it. So when you see on the test or out in the world the NOI of an investment property, just think to yourself, okay, that's after they've subtracted out for vacancy and after they've subtracted out all of the operating expenses, but not including a potential mortgage payment. The number that does include subtracting out for the mortgage payment is cash flow. That's the one at the very bottom line. What's the cash flow of the property? Wouldn't it be nice to have 10 properties cash flowing $1,000 each, right? $10,000 a month, automatic passive income cash flow in your pocket because you bought them a few years ago and you've paid them off and now you just make that money because the people pay their rent and that's what you end up with. That'd sort of be pretty cool. That's what these investors are after, is some amount of cash flow at the end of the day. And so cash flow is what you end up with as an investor after everything's been paid, including the loan. So just like NOI is related to market value, cash flow is related to the equity rate of return. And let me show you the two. That NOI looks like this. Oh, wow. Okay. Ran out of layers. Okay, one more layer. There we go. The NOI, we've got our cap rate, and we've got our market value. Cash flow is related to the rate of return. What's the rate of return on your money? That's what we're talking about here, as well as the original investment. So you might see a problem that says the cash flow, according to the financial statement, is, let's say, $700,000. I'm just pulling numbers from air here. The original investment that it cost you to buy this property was $500,000. What's the rate of return if your original investment was $500 and the current cash flow is $700? Just divide. Rate of return is 1.4. Let's see, 140%. That's pretty nice. Probably pretty fictional, right? Let's do, maybe that cash flow is more like, let's call it 70,000 instead of 700,000. What's that look like? 70,000. That's a rate of return of 14%. You with me now? See the point? The point of this equation or circle formula is to figure out what your rate of return is based on your original investment and the cash flow that the property generates. Cash flow being what you get after you pay, allow for vacancy, operating expenses, and debt service. This is like a lot, right, for you to grasp at 9:30. And I understand that. This is kind of an intimidating looking formula. Let's look at this next thing, and we will revisit this when we come back together. But before we go, a couple more minutes here. Here's an example. If we had gross income of $400,000 a year on the property, investment property, and a vacancy rate of 5%, operating expenses are $50,000 a year, and debt service, the mortgage payment, is $75,000 a year, and the capitalization rate that the investor wants to get is 8% or has done research and determined, and the original investment is $100,000, can we calculate both the NOI and the market value? Okay. We take our gross income. It's $400,000. Subtract the vacancy. That was 5%. We could have done that by calculating 95% of 400,000, right? Because we know that they said the vacancy was 5%, and we know the gross income is 400,000. So what's 5% of 400,000? There's that 20. That's how they get that 20. So that leaves 380 after allowing for the vacancy rate. Now, we're going to subtract out 50,000 for those operating expenses to run this thing as an investment. That brings us down to 330. So our net operating income is 330,000. And since we know the cap rate goes down here, and we know the cap rate they're shooting for is 8%, now we can just do that math. 330,000 divided by 8% tells us that the approximate market value of this property is $4,125,000. So that's how we can get to the market value by using the NOI. If we continue on down the line, though, we are also told that the debt service per year is $75,000. So let's subtract that from the 330 NOI. That leaves us a cash flow after paying everything, including debt service, of $255. Now let's take that $255 and plug it in to a similar looking formula. $255. Do we know our original investment? It had told us that it was $100,000, right? So if we take our $255 and divide it by that $100,000, that gives us where'd it go? Well, there's the cap rate and the market and the NOI resulting in that market value, and then it didn't give it to us. But it's the same kind of concept. Divide that cash flow by the original investment to get the equity rate of return. We'll do this when we come back together next week. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you a couple closing calculations to work on, and I gave you the one that we did tonight. Just keep working your way through. The next thing in line was this chapter 13, I believe. So the next one is going to be 14, and so keep on working your way through the syllabus. But I'll see you next week. Let me know if you have any questions. Bring your questions from the midterm. Go ahead and start working on those practice exams too. And let me know any questions you might run into based on those as well. Besides that, appreciate you guys, and I hope you have a great weekend. I'll see you next week.